Every great storyteller has the stories they tell the crowds, and then they have the ones they keep for the quiet moments, for the friends who stay after everyone else has gone home. Tonight, you're that friend. We're not going to read the big, famous chapters. We're going to open the book to the dusty, forgotten pages, to the storyteller's private collection of beautiful oddities. If you enjoy being let in on these little secrets, you're welcome to subscribe for more. It's strangely comforting to share these forgotten tales with someone. Feel free to say hello in the comments and let me know you're here. So, let the crowds go home. And let me tell you a secret story. Chapter 1. The Doubt. The silence of the seminary library was a heavy woolen blanket smothering the world outside and amplifying the hollow echo in Eli's own chest. It was a silence his mother would have filled with a hum, a soft tune from some long-forgotten hymn. Her absence was a phantom limb, an ache so profound it had begun to erode the very foundations of his world. For Eli, a theology student who had built his life on the bedrock of faith, the ground had turned to shifting sand. The God of comfort and promises felt distant, a deity of closed ears and averted eyes. His thesis assignment lay before him on the worn oak desk, the printed sheet a stark white accusation. Divine Anomalies, a study of bizarre narratives in Scripture. Professor Adams, with his kind eyes and unshakable certainty, had suggested it, a gentle nudge back toward the texts Eli had once loved. But now the words felt like a taunt. Bizarre. Anomalies. It was a catalog of the absurd, a syllabus for the ridiculous. How could he, whose prayers had seemingly evaporated into the sterile hospital air, find meaning in tales that defied reason? With a sigh that felt dredged from his soul, he pulled a heavy, leather-bound Bible closer. The scent of old paper and piety filled his nostrils, a familiar scent that now felt alien. He flipped through the thin, gilded pages, the whisper of them the only sound in the vast room. His fingers found the book of Numbers, chapter 22, the story of Balaam. He read of the Moabite king's fear, the summons for a prophet to curse a nation. He read of Balaam's journey, the divine permission granted with a warning. And then he reached the verses that made his brow furrow in sheer disbelief. A talking donkey, not a metaphor, not a vision, but a literal vocal animal seeing an angel of the Lord where its master saw nothing. Eli leaned back, a dry, humorless laugh catching in his throat. It was ludicrous. A divine messenger, a being of pure celestial fire, and the chosen method of communication was a stubborn pack animal complaining about being beaten. He pictured the scene, the dusty path, the narrow mountain pass, the frustrated prophet, and the suddenly articulate beast of burden. The sheer, unadulterated strangeness of it should have been the final straw, the proof that this was all a collection of primitive myths. Yet something else stirred beneath the skepticism, a flicker of the old curiosity that had first drawn him to these ancient texts. It wasn't the miracle itself that snagged his attention, but the method. God, in his infinite power, had used the lowest, most humble, most unexpected creature to open a man's eyes. He had used the absurd to convey a profound truth. The thought was a pebble dropped into the stagnant pond of his grief, sending out ripples he couldn't ignore. Had there been donkeys in his own life? Unexpected, humble moments where a glimmer of something had broken through? A stranger's hand on his shoulder in the funeral home line, the barista who had simply said, It looks like you're carrying the world today, for no reason at all. Small, seemingly insignificant things that had, for a fleeting second, held a weight they shouldn't have. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, Eli opened a fresh black journal. The blank page stared back, an empty confessional. He uncapped his pen, the click echoing in the silence. He did not write a prayer or a statement of belief. He began to write a question, framing it around a prophet and his talking donkey. He wrote of the absurdity, the humor, the sheer impracticality of it all. And then he wrote of the possibility, the terrifying, beautiful possibility that the divine voice might not always roar from the whirlwind. Sometimes it might speak through the most mundane of creatures if only one had the ears to hear. The pen moved steadily, etching his doubt onto the page, not to banish it, but to give it a name and a space to breathe. Chapter 2. The Talking Donkey. The words from his journal seemed to bleed into the very air of the library, coloring the dusty sunbeams with a new, unsettling hue. Eli's skepticism was a familiar, heavy cloak, but the thread of curiosity pulled at its seams, urging him deeper into the desert with Balaam. He returned to the text, his focus narrowing, no longer reading with the detached eye of a critic, but with the immersive gaze of a traveler on the same rocky path. He envisioned the prophet, a man of some renown, writing with a sense of self-important purpose, his mind occupied with the rewards of kings and the weight of his own divination. The donkey was merely a vehicle, a dumb beast of burden whose only role was to obey. But on that narrow trail, hemmed in by vineyard walls, the world shifted. Eli's mind painted the scene in vivid detail, the angel of the Lord standing as an invisible, blazing obstacle, a sword drawn and ready. The donkey, its animal perception unclouded by ambition or greed, saw the terrifying truth. It shied away, crushing Balaam's foot against the stone wall. The prophet's frustration would have been a palpable heat. His curse is not divine, but human and sharp. He beat the animal, his blows a testament to his blindness. Again, in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, the donkey saw the angel and lay down, a silent, stubborn protest against an unseen danger. Balaam's wrath flared anew, a storm of indignation. Then came the moment of impossible rupture. As Balaam raised his staff a third time, the fabric of reality tore. The donkey's mouth, designed for braying and chewing coarse feed, formed human words. The sound would not have been a heavenly choir, but a rough, guttural, and utterly bewildering speech. "What have I done to you, that you have struck me these 3 times?" The question hung in the desert air, a paradox given voice. Eli could almost hear the stunned silence that must have followed, the staff frozen mid-air, the prophet's mind scrambling to reconcile the impossible. The argument that ensued was not between a man and his beast, but between 2 conscious beings, one of whom happened to be a donkey. The animal's logic was impeccable, its defense a stark contrast to Balaam's blind rage. It was only then, as the donkey finished speaking, that the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel for himself, the true source of the obstruction. Eli leaned back, the library chair groaning softly. The absurdity was still there, but it was now layered with a profound and unsettling truth. God had not sent a thundering vision or a consuming fire to correct his prophet. He had used the most ignored, the most beaten down, the most humble instrument available. The voice of divine rebuke had come from the mouth of a donkey. His gaze drifted from the page to the window, where the city lights were beginning to prick the evening gloom. The story was no longer just an ancient curiosity. It was a key turning in the lock of his own memory. He thought of the raw, gaping wound of the weeks following his mother's funeral. The world had been a monochrome landscape of grief, and his faith had felt like a empty, echoing cathedral. One afternoon, drowning in that silence, he had gone to a coffee shop, a futile attempt at normalcy. He must have looked as shattered as he felt, his hands trembling slightly as he took his cup. The elderly man behind the counter, his face a road map of a long life, had not just handed him the coffee. He had held Eli's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes soft with a knowing kindness. "The sun still finds a way to rise, son," he had said, his voice quiet but firm, even on the darkest mornings. It was a simple, almost cliché sentiment. From anyone else, it might have felt hollow. But in that moment, from that stranger, the words had landed not as a platitude, but as a profound, unexpected grace. They had been a pinprick of light in his personal darkness, a moment of clarity and comfort that had no logical source. He had not been seeking it, just as Balaam had not been seeking a talking donkey. It had simply been given. A humble, mundane moment had become a vessel for something divine. The donkey on the path, the stranger in the coffee shop, both were unexpected messengers, cracking open the shell of a man's perception to let a sliver of truth shine through. The angel's words to Balaam echoed in the sudden, ringing silence that followed the donkey's speech, a divine rebuke sharper than any staff. Balaam, his pride thoroughly dismantled, crumpled to the dust, his face pressed against the earth in a posture of complete surrender. The prophet, who had set out to curse for gold, now found his own will broken, his mouth no longer his own to command. Eli followed the narrative as Balaam, chastened and humbled, continued his journey, but the man who arrived before the king of Moab was not the same one who had left. Standing on the barren heights, overlooking the vast, sprawling camp of Israel, Balaam opened his mouth, but instead of curses, blessings flowed forth, rich, poetic, and unstoppable. He spoke of a people set apart, a nation destined for greatness, his own intended malice transformed into divine praise by the God who had used a donkey to steer his heart. Eli watched the scene unfold in his mind's eye, the frustrated king, the defiant prophet, and the powerful, untamable blessings that sealed a nation's fate. The story's resolution was not in dramatic battles or plagues, but in a profound change of heart, a redirected purpose. The talking donkey was not the punchline of a joke, but the crucial pivot upon which history turned. God had not needed a mighty warrior or a silver-tongued orator. He had needed a man who could be humbled, and he used the lowliest of creatures to achieve it. Closing the Bible, Eli felt the weight of the parallel settling over his own shoulders. His own journey had been one of intellectual pride, of building faith on a foundation of logic and theological precision. When that foundation crumbled under the weight of his mother's death, he had judged God as silent, his faith as a failed construct. He had been like Balaam, blind on the path, beating against the stubborn obstacles of his grief, unable to see the divine purpose at work. His prejudices had been subtle, a belief that God only spoke in grand gestures, in answered prayers and clear-cut miracles. He had dismissed the small, the humble, the mundane as insignificant, just as Balaam had dismissed his donkey. Yet it was in those very humble means that he now saw the fingerprints of something greater. The stranger's kind words in the coffee shop, the unexpected comfort from a friend who simply sat with him in silence, the sudden, piercing beauty of a sunset on a day he felt utterly lost. These were his talking donkeys. They were the unassuming, often overlooked vessels through which a sliver of grace had pierced his darkness. God's methods were not his methods. The divine economy seemed to favor the foolish to shame the wise, the weak to shame the strong. This realization did not instantly erase his doubt, but it began to reframe it. The questions that had felt like anchors dragging him into despair now felt like sails catching a new wind. What if his doubt was not a failure of faith, but a necessary narrowing of the path, forcing him to see what he had been missing? What if God was not absent, but was communicating in a language he had been too proud, too grief-stricken to understand? The story of Balaam was no longer an absurdity to be dissected for a thesis. It was a mirror, and in its reflection, Eli saw his own blindness, his own need for humility. He saw that great purposes could be achieved through the most unexpected of means, and that perhaps his own fractured faith could be rebuilt not on a pillar of fire, but on the quiet, stubborn faithfulness of a donkey's rebuke and the simple, healing power of a stranger's kindness. Chapter 3. The floating axe head. The iron sank with a final gurgling sigh, a dark shape swallowed by the river's murky embrace. It was not a dramatic loss, not the fall of a kingdom or the shattering of a prophecy, but something far more mundane and, in its own way, far more devastating. A borrowed axe head, the very means of a man's labor and survival, was gone, vanished into the deep, leaving behind only the useless weight of a wooden handle. Eli read the account in the 6th chapter of 2 Kings, his focus captured by the sheer practical desperation of the moment. A company of prophets, expanding their dwelling place, their work halted by a single slip of the wrist, a single moment of misfortune that sent precious iron spinning into the abyss. The cry that went up was not for deliverance from armies, but from the quiet catastrophe of a borrowed tool lost. Alas, master, for it was borrowed. Eli could feel the man's despair as if it were his own, the cold clutch of panic, the shame of the loss, the helpless stare into water that refused to give up its prize. It was a small story, tucked between tales of kings and battles, yet it held a profound intimacy. This was not a grand theological puzzle. It was a story about a man who had lost something he needed, something that did not even belong to him. And into this scene of mundane crisis stepped the prophet Elisha. There was no lengthy prayer, no summoning of whirlwinds. The prophet simply asked, "Where did it fall?" He then cut a stick and threw it into the water at that exact spot. The miracle that followed was one of quiet, impossible physics. The iron did not leap from the water, it swam. It rose from the riverbed, defying its own nature, and floated to the surface like a piece of buoyant wood. Eli stared at the words, his mind conjuring the image, the dark, waterlogged chunk of metal bobbing gently on the current, a silent mockery of gravity and density. Then the iron did swim. The simplicity of the statement was breathtaking. It was a miracle of restoration, of recovery, a divine intervention not for the fate of nations, but for the integrity of a poor man and the return of a borrowed axe. The sheer practicality of it struck Eli with the force of a revelation. God, in his infinite wisdom, cared about the borrowed axe heads. He was concerned with the small, sharp disappointments, the everyday losses that could cripple a person's spirit as effectively as any grand tragedy. This was a God who entered into the minutiae of human worry, who understood that a lost tool could feel like a lost hope. The miracle was not about the spectacle, but about the solution. It was an act of profound personal care. As the image of the floating iron shimmered in his mind, it dissolved into another memory, one he had long buried under the weight of his more recent grief. He was 16, and his grandfather's pocket watch, a heavy silver heirloom, had been entrusted to him for a single afternoon. He had fumbled it on the way home, the watch slipping from his fingers and skittering across the pavement, vanishing down a storm drain with a tiny definitive plink. The despair that had washed over him then was a cold, childish echo of the prophet's cry. It was not just a watch, it was history, a tangible piece of his gentle, stoic grandfather. He had lain on the wet pavement, peering into the grate's darkness, his world shrunk to that single, irreplaceable loss. For days, the guilt had been a leaden weight in his stomach. Then his father, a quiet man of few words, had gone to the city works department. He returned hours later, his clothes smudged with grime, his hand extended. In his palm lay the watch, scratched and damp, but whole. He had not said a word about the trouble, only handed it back with a small understanding nod. It had felt like a miracle, a small personal resurrection of something he thought was gone forever. Sitting in the library, Eli saw the parallel with stunning clarity. His father's quiet, determined effort was his own floating axe head. It was a small, practical act of redemption that had spoken of a love attentive to his despair. And if a human father could care so deeply about a lost watch, could the divine not care about the lost axe heads of the soul, the lost hopes, the lost joys, the lost pieces of a heart shattered by grief? The God of Elisha was a God who threw sticks into the deep, dark waters of human trouble, not always to part them, but to make the heavy things float again, to restore what was lost. The miracle was in the details, a quiet testament that no loss, no matter how small or practical, was beneath his notice. The prophet's hand, gnarled and steady, reached out and plucked the iron from the water's surface as simply as one might pick an apple from a low-hanging branch. There was no fanfare, no chorus of angels, only the quiet, practical conclusion to a moment of crisis. The axe head, once a dead weight in the river's grip, was now restored, its cold, wet iron solid and real in the man's palm. The work could continue. The debt of the borrowed tool was erased. Eli watched. The scene complete itself in his mind. The relief of the young prophet, a palpable warmth spreading through the cool air by the Jordan. It was a miracle measured not in scale, but in its perfect, targeted sufficiency. God had not provided a new axe or a chest of gold. He had returned precisely what was lost, healing the break in the mundane fabric of the man's day. This concept of divine provision in the ordinary began to unfold within Eli like a slow-blooming flower. His thesis, once a catalogue of absurdities, was becoming a gallery of divine attentiveness. The God who spoke through donkeys was also the God who made axe heads float. This was not a deity confined to cosmic battles and prophetic pronouncements. This was a God intimately concerned with borrowed tools, with lost coins, with the small, sharp anxieties that comprise the bulk of a human life. Faith then was not just about believing God could part seas, but about trusting that He noticed when something precious sank beneath the personal surface of one's own river. The thought was still simmering in him later that week when his friend Leo called, his voice frayed with frustration. Leo's ancient record player, a cherished relic from his father, had finally given out mid-album, the needle arm dropping with a lifeless thud. To Leo, it wasn't just a machine, it was the vessel for 1,000 memories, the soundscape of his childhood. Eli, who had always been good with his hands, found himself kneeling on the floor of Leo's apartment, the guts of the turntable spread out before him like a complex metal puzzle. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and the silence of the broken speaker was a heavy presence in the room. For an hour, Eli traced wires, tested connections, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was finicky, frustrating work, his fingers clumsy with a focus he hadn't realized he possessed. Then he saw it, a tiny, almost invisible spring that had slipped from its housing, a minuscule coil of metal lost in the dark machinery. It was the record player's axe head. Using a pair of tweezers, his hand remarkably steady, he managed to coax the spring back into its proper place. He reassembled the housing, his movements careful and deliberate. He placed a record on the platter, lowered the arm, and held his breath. The crackle of the vinyl was the first sound, a familiar warm static. Then the rich, soaring notes of a trumpet filled the room, clear and strong. Leo's face transformed, the lines of worry smoothing into an expression of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. He didn't say anything, just closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. In that moment, Eli felt a shift within himself, a quiet, profound realignment. He had not performed a miracle, but he had been an instrument of restoration. He had thrown a stick, his own patience and skill, into the murky waters of his friend's distress, and something had floated to the surface. The music was the proof. Driving home, the city lights streaking past his windows, Eli understood. This was his modern-day floating axe head. It was a small, practical moment where care had intervened in the face of a mundane loss. It was a glimpse of the same divine economy he was studying, a God who worked through human hands and humble means to mend what was broken, to restore what was silenced. His faith, which had been a theoretical structure crumbling under the weight of theodicy, began to find a new, more resilient footing. It was shifting from a fortress to be defended to a current to be joined, a participatory trust in a God who was present not only in the cataclysmic, but in the quiet click of a restored spring and the return of a familiar song. The axe head had floated, and in its wake something heavy in Eli's own spirit began to rise. Chapter 4. The sun stands still. The world could end not with a bang, but with a hesitation. Eli read the words in the 10th chapter of Joshua, and the very axis of his imagination tilted. The Amorite kings were massing, a coalition of fear and steel descending upon the Gibeonites. Joshua, in a bold act of covenant loyalty, marched his army through the night, a forced march of faith and desperation. And then, in the heat of battle, as the sun blazed over Gibeon and the moon glowed in the valley of Aijalon, The prayer that defied the cosmos was uttered. Joshua, his voice raw with the dust of battle and the fire of divine commission, did not ask for strength for his men or weakness for his enemies. He commanded the very celestial bodies themselves. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. Eli's mind, trained in the orderly laws of physics and the predictable rhythms of creation, recoiled. Then it soared. He envisioned the scene not as a sterile theological proposition, but as a cataclysm of sensory overload. The battle would have been a roaring chaos of clashing bronze, the screams of men and horses, the coppery smell of blood soaking into the sun-baked earth, and then the command, a silence perhaps, deeper than any silence, falling not on the ears but on the soul. The sun, a molten gold coin in the sky, did not set. It halted. Its descent ceased. Its light arrested in mid-air, casting long, impossible shadows that did not lengthen. The moon, a pale ghost in the opposite sky, froze in its ascent. Time itself stretched, warped, and stood still. The awe would have been a physical blow. Soldiers on both sides would have faltered, their weapons lowering as they stared dumbfounded at a sky that had betrayed its most fundamental law. The day did not end. The heat did not relent. The battle, which should have been curtailed by dusk, raged on in an extended, surreal twilight. For nearly a full day, the universe held its breath, the gears of creation grinding to a miraculous halt, so that a single human-scale act of justice could be completed. The text stated it with a simplicity that was more staggering than any elaborate description. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since. Eli leaned back, the library walls seeming to dissolve around him. He was no longer in a quiet room of books, but standing on that bloody field, feeling the uncanny, unending daylight on his skin, a witness to a moment when God had bent the rules of his own universe to fight for his people. It was a display of power so absolute, so intimate, that it dwarfed the parting of seas and the falling of walls. This was control over the very framework of existence. And as the cosmic awe of the story settled over him, it bled into a different, more personal kind of stillness. The image of the frozen sun dissolved, replaced by the sterile, fluorescent glare of a hospital room. It was the long vigil of his mother's final illness. In that room, time had also lost its meaning. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall became a mockery, each second a grain of sand in an hourglass that had already been shattered. Day and night blurred into a single, seamless stretch of aching consciousness. The world outside, with its rush hours, its setting suns, its changing weather, ceased to exist. There was only the rasp of labored breath, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the slow, agonizing drip of the IV. In that suspended reality, every moment was stretched to its breaking point, heavy with a finality that made the air thick and difficult to breathe. It was his own valley of Ajalon, a place where the moon of grief seemed frozen in a sky of despair. The battle was not against Amorites, but against the creeping shadow of loss, a fight he was destined to lose. Yet, in that terrible, stretched-out time, there had been a strange, painful clarity. The trivialities of life had fallen away, leaving only the raw, essential truth of love and impending absence. It was a divine halting of life's normal rush, not for victory, but for a long-last goodbye. The sun had stood still for Joshua, so he could complete his work. For Eli, time had stood still so he could simply be present to etch every last detail of his mother's face into his soul. Before the long night finally fell, the extended day over Gibeon did not end in a whimper, but in the thunderous silence of a completed victory. The enemy kings were defeated, their armies routed under the unyielding, miraculous light. Joshua's faith had not just moved mountains, it had arrested the sun in its celestial path. The story concluded not with an explanation of the mechanics, but with the simple, staggering fact of it. God had listened to the voice of a man, and the universe had obeyed. This was not a God bound by natural law, but the author of natural law, who could suspend his own decrees to fulfill a promise. The victory belonged to Israel, but the awe belonged to every human heart that dared to contemplate the magnitude of such an intervention. For Eli, the awe was a quiet, spreading warmth that began to thaw the frozen places within him. Joshua's story was no longer just a historical account of cosmic manipulation. It was a testament to a God who intervened in time itself to secure the destiny of his people. If God could stop the sun for a battle, could he not also stretch out a moment of grace in the life of a grieving student? The thought was not an intellectual conclusion, but a dawning, visceral hope. The same power that had halted a celestial body was intimately concerned with the timeline of a single, broken heart. Driven by an impulse that felt both foreign and familiar, Eli closed his books and left the library. The evening air was cool on his skin, the city lights blurring into soft halos as he walked without a clear destination. He found himself at the small, quiet chapel on the edge of the seminary grounds, a place he had avoided for months. The door groaned softly as he pushed it open, and the scent of old wood and beeswax enveloped him. The space was empty, lit only by the crimson glow of the sanctuary lamp. He slid into a back pew, the polished wood cool beneath his hands. He did not kneel, he did not form elaborate prayers. He simply sat in the stillness, the story of the sun and the memory of his mother's final, suspended hours, mingling in the quiet. He thought of Joshua's bold command, a prayer born of desperate faith in the middle of a crisis. And so, in the silent chapel, Eli offered up his own, far quieter petition. It was not a command, but a request, whispered from the depths of his weariness. He prayed for guidance in his studies, for the clarity to see not just the bizarre events in the texts, but the hand that orchestrated them. He prayed for the strength to face his own lingering grief, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a valley to be traversed. He asked for his own personal sun to stand still, not to prolong a battle, but to provide a space for healing, for understanding, for peace. And as he sat there, a remarkable thing happened. Nothing in the external world changed. The sanctuary lamp still glowed, the city still hummed outside, but internally a profound and unexpected quiet settled over him. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a deep, resonant peace, a sense of being held in a stillness that was stronger than time, more solid than grief. It felt like the universe itself was pausing just for him, not to grant a victory, but to offer a moment of pure, unadulterated grace. The heavy weight on his chest seemed to lighten, not because the loss was gone, but because he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was not carrying it alone. Leaving the chapel, the world seemed sharper, more vivid. The stories he was studying began to shift in his perception. They were no longer isolated anomalies, but interconnected threads in a vast divine narrative. The talking donkey, the floating axe head, the stilled sun, they were all expressions of the same relentless, creative, and deeply personal love. He started to see this pattern not only in the ancient texts, but in the tapestry of his own life. The stranger's kindness, the restored record player, the extended, painful vigil at his mother's bedside, each event, whether joyful or sorrowful, now appeared as a point where a larger purpose had intersected with his personal timeline. God's hand was not absent from history or from his story. It was actively weaving both, using the bizarre, the mundane, and the miraculous to guide, to correct, to provide, and to redeem. The sun had stood still for Joshua, and in the quiet of a chapel, a different kind of light had begun to dawn for Eli, illuminating a path forward through the pages of Scripture and the landscape of his own healing heart. Chapter 5. The left-handed rescue. The dagger was a secret, a sliver of polished steel honed for a single, brutal purpose. And it was carried not on the right hip, where a king's guards would expect a threat, but on the left, strapped to the thigh of a man whose very body was a disguise. Eli read the 3rd chapter of Judges, and the story of Ehud unfolded with the tense, calculated rhythm of a spy thriller. Israel had groaned for 18 years under the oppressive, corpulent weight of King Eglon of Moab. Deliverance came not from a vast army or a thundering prophet, but from a single, left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin, a tribe whose name, Eli noted with a historian's interest, literally meant son of the right hand. The irony was sharp, a divine joke woven into the genealogy. Ehud was an anomaly, a man whose dominant hand made him an outsider in a right-handed world, and God was about to turn that perceived weakness into the key that would unlock a nation's prison. Eli pictured the scene in the opulent, stifling throne room of Eglon's summer palace in Jericho. The king, a man of immense girth, sat in his cool upper room, surrounded by the trappings of his power. Ehud approached, leading a delegation bearing tribute, a seemingly subservient vassal. The guards, their eyes scanning for the telltale bulge of a sword on the right hip, saw nothing amiss. They did not frisk the left thigh. They did not account for the unexpected. With a solemn declaration that he had a secret message from God for the king, Ehud secured a private audience. Eglon, intrigued, dismissed his attendants. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the king's fate. In the sudden privacy, Ehud's left hand moved with a swift, practiced motion. He drew the double-edged dagger from his right thigh, and in one fluid, devastating thrust, he buried the entire blade into the king's vast belly. The fat, the text stated with grim simplicity, closed over the blade. Ehud left the dagger buried in the king's body, locked the doors behind him, and escaped, his left-handedness having been the perfect, unsuspected weapon. Eli sat back, the narrative of violent liberation settling over him. It was a shocking, bloody story, yet its core truth resonated deeply. God had not chosen a conventional hero. He had chosen a man whose very physicality was a strategic surprise. Ehud's left-handedness wasn't a disability. It was his divine qualification. It was the specific, unique trait that allowed him to bypass the world's defenses and accomplish what no right-handed man could have. God had used the unconventional to achieve the impossible. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the open pages of the Bible. They were capable, steady, right-handed hands. He had never given his handedness a second thought. It was the default, the norm. But Ehud's story forced him to consider the unique traits in himself and others, the things that might be seen as oddities or disadvantages. What were his own left-handed qualities? Perhaps it was his tendency toward quiet introspection in a world that valued extroversion, or his stubborn curiosity that sometimes felt more like doubt than faith. These were not traits he had ever considered particularly useful, let alone strategic, in any divine plan. Yet Ehud's dagger was a powerful metaphor. God's arsenal was not limited to conventional weapons. It included the quirks, the idiosyncrasies, the very things that made people feel different. The thought propelled him into action. The introspection of the library, while valuable, began to feel like a preparation for something more. He needed to find a modern-day Moab, a place where his own right-handed skills could be of use. A quick online search led him to a local homeless shelter, Haven of Hope, that was putting out a call for volunteers to help organize their donation storage. A chaotic labyrinth of clothing, canned goods, and household items that had become unmanageable. It seemed a world away from regicide and national deliverance, but it felt right. The following Saturday, Eli found himself in the basement of the shelter, surrounded by towering, precarious piles of donated goods. The air was thick with the smell of old fabric and detergent. The task was immense, a logistical nightmare. But as he began to sort, a strange sense of clarity descended upon him. His methodical, analytical mind, the same one that had meticulously deconstructed biblical narratives, was perfectly suited for this. He created systems, labeling sections, building sturdy shelves from discarded lumber he found behind the building, his right-handed dexterity making quick work of the hammer and nails. He organized the chaos into a functional, accessible inventory. It was not a dramatic act of rescue, but it was a practical one. He was using his particular skills to bring order, to make it easier for the shelter staff to find a warm coat for a shivering man or a can of soup for a hungry family. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, looking at the newly ordered room, he felt a profound connection to Ehud. The judge had used his unique trait to plunge a dagger into the heart of oppression. Eli had used his to sort cans of vegetables and stack sweaters. The scale was incomparable, yet the principle felt the same. He was using what he had, who he was, to address a need. He was a right-handed man in a right-handed world, but God was showing him that every person with their specific blend of talents, temperament, and even perceived flaws had a unique role to play in the ongoing story of deliverance and care. The left-handed rescue was not just a historical event. It was a timeless paradigm. God was still in the business of using the unexpected to accomplish his purposes, and that day, in a dusty basement, Eli felt the quiet, humbling honor of having his own ordinary right-handed abilities enlisted in the cause. Chapter 6. The Whale's Belly. The storm was not outside the ship, but within the man. Eli read the first chapter of Jonah, and he felt the prophet's flight in the marrow of his own bones, the desperate, foolish scramble to outrun a divine call, to flee to the very ends of the earth, rather than face the uncomfortable, terrifying task set before him. Jonah boarded a ship to Tarshish, a direction diametrically opposed to Nineveh, and Eli understood the impulse intimately. It was the same impulse that had driven him into the deep silent waters of academic study. After his mother's death, using theology as a ship to carry him away from the raw, screaming shore of his grief. He had been running to his own Tarshish, seeking the oblivion of intellectual pursuit rather than the painful necessary work of mourning. The storm that God hurled upon the sea was a tempest of pure consequence, a cosmic refusal to let the prophet hide. The sailors, seasoned men of the sea, were terrified by its unnatural ferocity, while Jonah slept in the hold, a deep, stubborn sleep of denial. Eli saw himself in that hold, buried in books and notepads, trying to sleep through the emotional hurricane that raged inside him. But the storm would not be ignored. The lot fell to Jonah and his own confession. I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land, was a stark admission of his rebellion. The solution was as drastic as the storm. He was thrown into the raging waters, and the sea grew instantly calm. His removal brought peace to others, but for Jonah, the true trial was just beginning. Then came the great fish. Not a whale in the original text, but a creature appointed by God, a living, breathing, swallowing prison. Eli's mind recoiled from the visceral horror of it, the plunge into the cold, dark deep, the terror of the closing throat, the descent into a belly not of water, but of digestive acid and suffocating darkness. The belly of the fish was not a place of punishment, but of preservation. It was a grotesque, divinely ordained womb, a place of absolute isolation where a runaway prophet could not run any further. For 3 days and 3 nights Jonah was entombed in the deep, surrounded by the reek of seaweed and the cacophony of submarine groans, utterly and completely trapped with the consequences of his own choices. And in that darkness, something broke. The prayer recorded in the 2nd chapter was a psalm of sheer, desperate dependency. From the belly of Sheol, Jonah cried out. Stripped of all his agency, all his escape routes, he finally turned his face toward the God he had been fleeing. The fish's belly became his sanctuary, the very pit of despair transforming into a place of prayer and reorientation. It was there, in the absolute dark, that he remembered the light. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The deliverance, when it came, was as dramatic as the capture. At God's command, the fish vomited Jonah onto dry land, a man reborn, soaked in brine and humility, ready at last to go to Nineveh. Eli closed the book, the imagery clinging to him like a damp shroud. He had been living in the belly of a whale of his own making. His grief was the great fish that had swallowed him whole after his mother's death. He had not run to a physical Tarshish, but he had fled into a deep internal ocean of avoidance. He had let the waves of sorrow carry him down into a silent, dark place where he thought he could wait out the storm, where he could remain suspended, untouched by the need to truly feel the pain, to process the loss, to emerge onto the unfamiliar and painful shore of a life without her. His studies, his thesis, his journaling, they had all been a form of that deep, stubborn sleep in the ship's hold, a way to ignore the divine call to face his emotions head on. That night, he dreamed. He was in a vast, dark space, warm and pulsating, the air thick and difficult to breathe. The walls glistened in the low light, and he knew, with a dreamer's certainty, that he was inside the whale. There was no panic, only a profound, weary acceptance. In the dream, he saw his mother's face, not as she was in sickness, but radiant and smiling, holding out her hand. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a message of release. Then a violent lurch, a sense of being propelled upward through a tight, suffocating passage, and he was expelled onto a bright, sun-drenched beach, gasping and new. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, the feeling of the salt air and the gritty sand still vivid on his skin. The dream had been a catalyst, cracking open the shell he had built around his heart. Lying in the pre-dawn gloom, he made a decision. He would stop running. He would no longer treat the whale's belly as a permanent residence. He would face the grief, the anger, the vast, empty silence his mother had left behind. He saw the whale not as a monster of punishment, but as a metaphor for a necessary, transformative containment. It was the dark, difficult, and isolating process that ultimately led to a new beginning, to being spit out onto a new shore, ready for a new purpose. Jonah had been delivered to his Nineveh. Eli, rising from his bed with a resolve he hadn't felt in a year, knew it was time to be delivered into the next chapter of his own life, to walk into the uncomfortable, grieving city of his own heart, and finally begin the work of healing. Chapter 7. Samson's Strength. The source of his power was not in the corded muscle of his arms or the broad set of his shoulders, but in a covenant etched into the very hair on his head, a sacred secret that made him a living weapon and a walking paradox. Eli delved into Judges 16, and the story of Samson unfolded like a tragic epic. A man of divine purpose and human frailty, whose strength was a loan from God, yet who lived as if it were his own possession. He read of the angel's announcement to his barren mother, the Nazirite vow that set him apart before his birth, forbidding wine and the razor. Samson was consecrated for a singular purpose, to begin the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines. Yet from the start he seemed less a judge and more a force of nature, governed by his own appetites. Eli followed his exploits, each one a display of raw, terrifying power that seemed to erupt from his personal passions. He tore a young lion apart with his bare hands as if it were a kid goat. He killed 30 men for their garments to pay a debt born of his own rash riddle. He caught 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail with torches, and set the Philistine fields ablaze in a fit of vengeance. Then, with the fresh jawbone of a donkey, a grisly, improvised tool, he slaughtered 1,000 men, his thirst afterward quenched by a miraculous spring God provided from the hollow of that very jaw. Each act was spectacular, each a demonstration of a strength so vast it defied comprehension. But Eli noted a chilling pattern. Samson's power was always reactive, a divine response to his personal provocations and predicaments. The strength was God's, but the agenda was often Samson's. The narrative took its inevitable downward turn with Delilah. Eli read of her repeated, wheedling inquiries, the Philistine gold glinting behind her words. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she pleaded, a question asked, not in awe, but in betrayal. 3 times Samson lied, and 3 times Delilah tested his lies, the Philistines waiting in her chamber. Eli could feel the slow, corrosive erosion of the man's resolve, the way his affection for this woman warred with his sacred calling. He was a man who could break ropes like flax and snap new bowstrings, but he could not break the spell of a treacherous love. The final surrender was a whisper that unraveled everything. No razor has ever been used on my head," he confessed, "for I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me." The scene that followed was one of the most intimate violations in all of Scripture. As Samson slept, his head in Delilah's lap, the betrayer summoned the man with the razor. The scrape of the blade against his scalp was the sound of a covenant being severed. Eli winced, imagining the sudden shocking vulnerability, the chill on his now bare skin. Then came the awful moment of awakening. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He shook himself, as he had so many times before, expecting the familiar surge of divine power to course through him. But this time it did not. He did not know that the Lord had left him. The verse was a thunderclap of spiritual desolation. The strength was gone, and with it, his identity. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and bound him with bronze shackles, reducing the living weapon to a grinding slave in their prison. Eli sat back, the tragedy of it settling like a weight in his chest. Samson's downfall was not in a battlefield defeat, but in a bedroom confession. He had mistaken the gift for the giver. He had treated the divine strength that flowed through him as a personal attribute, a talent to be used at his whim, and in doing so, he had severed the connection to its source. His physical blindness was merely the outward manifestation of a spiritual blindness that had plagued him all along. He had relied on his own might until the moment it was irrevocably gone. The story was a stark mirror, and Eli saw his own reflection with painful clarity. His own strength had always been his intellect, his ability to reason, to deconstruct, to understand. It was the fortress he had built for himself, and when his mother died, that fortress had crumbled. He had tried to rely on his own mental and emotional fortitude to weather the grief, and he had failed utterly. He had been like Samson, trusting in a power that was, in the end, insufficient. The realization was humbling, a shaving of his own pride. The following Tuesday, he found himself walking into a small, softly lit room in the basement of a community center. It was a grief support group, a place he had seen mentioned on a flyer and had, until now, walked past. The air smelled of cheap coffee and faint hope. He took a seat in the circle of folding chairs, his hands clenched in his lap. One by one, people began to share their stories of loss, of anger, of a pain so deep it had no bottom. They spoke of sleepless nights and empty houses, of birthdays and anniversaries that were now landmines of memory. They did not offer easy answers or pious platitudes. They simply offered their brokenness, and in that offering, they held each other up. When it was his turn, his voice was barely a whisper. He spoke of his mother, of the silence she left behind, of the theological crisis that felt like a personal failure. He did not try to sound wise or faithful. He simply told the truth. And as he spoke, a strange thing happened. The heavy, suffocating weight he had carried for so long felt shared. It did not vanish, but it became distributed across the circle, made lighter by the simple, profound act of communal bearing. He was not relying on his own intellect to solve his grief. He was learning to rely on others, and in doing so, he was taking the first tentative step toward relying on God in a new way, not as a theological concept to be understood, but as a source of strength that flowed through the compassion of strangers, through shared tears, through the quiet, sturdy presence of people who knew what it was to be weak. In that circle of brokenness, Eli felt a different kind of strength beginning to stir, one that was not his own and was therefore unshakable. Chapter 8. The plagues of Egypt. The river turned to blood, a thick, clotting crimson that choked the life from the veins of Egypt. Eli read the 7th chapter of Exodus, and the horror of it was not in the spectacle, but in the suffocation, the death of a nation's primary artery, the Nile, the source of its water, its food, its very identity. The fish died in putrefying masses, and the river stank. A sweet, sickly odor of decay that would have permeated every home, every breath. This was not a distant meteorological event. It was a visceral, intimate assault on the ordinary. The water in every jar, every bucket, every canal congealed into blood. Pharaoh's magicians replicated the trick, a dark parody of the divine, but they could not reverse it. They could only add to the horror, confirming the power at work while offering no solution. Eli imagined the desperation, the cracked lips and parched throats, the primal terror of a world where the most fundamental element of life had been twisted into a symbol of death. Then came the frogs. They erupted from the reeking waters, a seething, living tide of green and brown. They did not remain in the riverbanks. They invaded. They swarmed into houses, into bedrooms, into ovens and kneading bowls. They crawled into beds, their cold, slick bodies a violation of every private space. Eli could almost hear the cacophony, the endless grating croaks that would have drowned out conversation and sleep, the squelching underfoot with every step. The plague was a masterpiece of psychological torment, turning the familiar into the grotesque. Again, the magicians mimicked the act, summoning more of the loathsome creatures, but they could not make them leave. The power to bring a plague was one thing, the power to end it was another, and it belonged solely to the God of the Hebrews. Pharaoh's first fleeting concession was born of this overwhelming, disgusting pressure, but his heart hardened the moment the frogs died in stinking mountainous heaps. The relief was temporary, the lesson unlearned. The 3rd plague was a subtle shift, a descent into a new, more personal realm of misery. At Aaron's command, the dust of the earth became gnats, a fine biting cloud that settled on man and beast alike. The magicians, for the first time, failed. They could not replicate this act, and their admission was a pivotal moment in the narrative. This is the finger of God. The phrase sent a chill down Eli's spine. The finger of God. Not the full force of his arm, not the thunder of his voice, but just a single divine finger tracing a line in the dust, and the very earth itself rose up as a swarm of irritation and pain. There was no escaping it. The gnats were in the air, in the eyes, in the nose, a constant, maddening reminder of a power that could turn the ground beneath their feet against them. Eli sat in the quiet library, the descriptions of divine judgment burning in his mind. He was horrified by the scale of the suffering, the systematic dismantling of a civilization's comfort and security. Yet, woven through the horror was a dark, terrifying fascination. This was not the capricious wrath of a distant deity. It was a targeted, deliberate demonstration of supremacy over every facet of the Egyptian cosmos. The river god Hapi, the frog goddess Heket, the earth itself. It was a theological war fought on the battlefield of nature, and the god of slaves was winning. The power on display was absolute, a raw creative force wielded not for creation, but for liberation, even if the path to freedom was paved with the suffering of the oppressor. The vivid, textual chaos of the plagues bled into a memory of his own, a moment where nature had risen up, not with a divine command, but with its own indifferent fury. He had been 15 on a family camping trip in the hills when a flash flood tore through the canyon. It had been a dry, sunny day, but miles away a thunderstorm had dumped its load. The wall of water that came was not clear, but a churning, chocolate-brown torrent, thick with mud and the shattered bones of trees. It wasn't the Nile turning to blood, but it carried the same feeling of a fundamental, life-giving force turning murderous. He remembered the terrifying roar, the way the ground shook, the frantic scramble to higher ground. In its wake, the landscape was unrecognizable. Cars overturned, tents shredded, the familiar creek bed now a wide, scarred plain of debris. Sitting there years later, the two events, the ancient plagues and the modern flood, echoed each other. Both were displays of a power that dwarfed human ambition, that could rewrite geography and destiny in a matter of moments. He had seen in that flood no divine finger, only random, natural violence. But now, reading of the plagues, he wondered, was there a line between judgment and disaster, between an act of God and a natural event? The plagues were undeniably intentional, a series of escalating warnings. The flood was, by all accounts, a tragic accident of weather. Yet both forced a confrontation with human fragility. Both revealed that the systems humans build, whether empires or campsites, are terrifyingly vulnerable to the forces that govern the world. He pondered the tension between divine judgment and divine mercy. The plagues were an act of judgment on Egypt, but they were also the brutal, necessary prelude to an act of profound mercy for Israel. The flood had been a disaster for his family, destroying their trip, but it had also bonded them together in survival, teaching them a stark lesson about what truly mattered. In the horror of the blood and the frogs, and in the chaos of the brown, raging water, Eli began to sense a terrifying, beautiful, and deeply unsettling truth. That the same power that could curse could also redeem, and that the path to liberation, whether for a nation or a soul, sometimes had to lead through the river of blood. The final terrible plagues descended upon Egypt, not as a steady escalation, but as a shattering of the very order of life and death. Eli read of the swarms of flies that filled the air with a droning pestilence, a living filth that distinguished between Egyptian and Israelite, a divine line drawn in the sand of suffering. Then came the pestilence that struck the livestock in the fields, a silent, wasting death that crippled the economy and food supply, followed by the festering boils that broke out on man and beast, a personal, agonizing affliction that no ointment could soothe. Hail mixed with fire fell from the sky, a meteorological impossibility that shattered trees and flattened crops, a display of raw, untamed power that made a mockery of the sun god Ra. Locusts followed, a living, devouring wind that consumed every shred of green left by the hail, leaving the land a skeletal, barren waste. Finally, a darkness so thick it could be felt settled over the land for 3 days, a palpable, suffocating gloom that stilled all movement and choked the light from the world, a direct assault on the sun god himself. Each plague was a targeted demolition of an Egyptian deity, a systematic humiliation of a pantheon that had held a people in spiritual and physical bondage. But the 10th plague was different. It was not an assault on nature or the body, but on the heart, the death of the firstborn. Eli read the instructions for the Passover with a trembling sense of awe. The unblemished lamb, the blood smeared on the doorposts, the hurried, fearful meal eaten with sandaled feet and staff in hand. It was a ritual of faith and desperation, a stark choice between being under the shelter of the blood or exposed to the destroyer. That night, a great cry went up in Egypt, a sound of universal, keening grief. For there was not a house without someone dead. From the palace of Pharaoh to the dungeon of the prisoner, the angel of death passed through, and the cost of hardened pride was measured in the cold, still bodies of the firstborn. In the terrible, echoing silence of that midnight, Pharaoh's resistance finally broke. The will that had withstood rivers of blood and plagues of locusts shattered under the weight of personal loss. Up, leave my people. The command was a gasp of surrender, and so the Exodus began not as a stealthy escape, but as a divinely orchestrated expulsion. The enslaved people, marching out with the wealth of Egypt pressed into their hands, their liberation purchased at a horrific, sovereign cost. Eli saw the plagues not as arbitrary punishments, but as a brutal, necessary surgery to cut a nation free from the cancerous grip of oppression. They were a call to repentance screamed into the void of Pharaoh's hardened heart, a call that went unanswered until the ultimate price was paid. The freedom of Israel was born from the ashes of Egypt's grief. The story's weight settled on Eli, not as a historical curiosity, but as a personal challenge. He saw the parallels in his own life. He had been living in a kind of Egypt, a land of spiritual and emotional bondage built on the bricks of bitterness and unresolved hurt. A particular friend from his seminary days, Mark, came to mind. A misunderstanding over a collaborative project had spiraled into a sharp, painful argument. Harsh words had been exchanged, accusations of laziness and intellectual theft that had severed their friendship. Eli had carried the grudge for over a year, a cold, hard stone in his gut. He had replayed the argument in his head 100 times, fortifying his own righteousness and nurturing his anger. It was a small, personal Pharaoh, a stubborn resistance to the call of grace. The image of the Passover lamb, its blood a shield against judgment, struck him with profound force. Forgiveness, he realized, was a similar act. It was not about excusing the wrong or pretending the hurt didn't happen. It was about applying the costly grace of release to the doorposts of his own heart, creating a barrier against the destroyer of bitterness. To continue holding the grudge was to remain in the darkness of his own making, a self-imposed plague that poisoned his present and future. The Exodus story was a cosmic lesson in letting go, in allowing a hard heart to be broken so that freedom could begin. That afternoon, he found Mark's number in his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. His pride, his own personal Pharaoh, rallied its defenses, whispering justifications and rehearsing old grievances. But the memory of the great cry in Egypt, the sound of a freedom purchased at too high a cost, pushed him forward. He pressed call. When Mark answered, his voice cautious and surprised, Eli did not relitigate the argument. He did not assign blame. He simply said the words that felt like the application of blood to the doorpost. "Mark, I've been holding on to what happened between us, and I'm sorry for my part in it. I want you to know I forgive you, and I hope we can move on." The silence on the other end was long and heavy. Then a slow, relieved exhale. I've been thinking about that too, Eli. I'm sorry as well. Thank you. The conversation was brief, awkward, but the stone in Eli's gut dissolved. The plague of bitterness lifted. He felt a liberation so tangible it was like a physical weight being lifted from his shoulders. The air itself seemed easier to breathe. He had not condoned the wrong, but he had broken its power over him. He had chosen the exodus. In forgiving his friend, he had finally truly begun to forgive himself for his own failings and to accept the greater, more profound forgiveness offered to him. The plagues had been a call to repentance, and in answering that call in his own small world, Eli had found a freedom more precious than any departure from Egypt. Chapter 9. The burning bush the fire did not consume, and in that impossible holy paradox, a cosmos of ordinary expectation was unmade. Eli's mind journeyed to the backside of the Midian desert, a place of stark isolation where a fugitive prince turned shepherd named Moses tended another man's flock. The air would have been a dry, shimmering heat, the silence broken only by the bleating of sheep and the scuff of sandals on stone. Then a sight that defied the very nature of fire, a bush engulfed in flame, yet its leaves remained green, its branches unblackened, a living, burning contradiction that drew Moses from his path. It was not the fire itself that was miraculous, but its restraint, its refusal to devour what it touched. And from the heart of that unconsuming blaze, a voice called his name, not once, but twice, a personal address that transformed a curious spectacle into a divine encounter. Moses, Moses! The command that followed was as jarring as the sight. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Eli closed his eyes, the library fading away as he immersed himself in the scene. He could almost feel the grit of the sand between his own toes, the sudden, reverent vulnerability of bare feet on earth, electrified by the presence of God. This was not the thundering, earth-shaking power that parted seas or stopped the sun. This was an intimate, focused holiness, a sacredness that did not annihilate the mundane, but sanctified it. The ground was not holy because of its location, but because God had chosen to manifest His presence there. The bush was not special in itself. It was an ordinary desert shrub that became a vessel for the extraordinary. The voice from the fire identified itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a God of covenant and history now stepping into the present moment to commission a reluctant, stammering man for an impossible task. The burning bush was a threshold, a place where heaven touched earth without destroying it, where a man's life was irrevocably reoriented toward a purpose far greater than himself. The profound stillness of that moment, the holy hush of the unconsuming fire, began to ache within Eli. His own life felt so loud, so cluttered with the echoes of grief, the pressure of his thesis, the cacophony of his own doubts. He longed for a patch of holy ground, a place where he could take off the sandals of his intellectual pride and emotional defenses and simply listen. The story was a potent reminder that God did not only speak in the cataclysmic or the bizarre, but in the quiet, focused moments of attention. The burning bush was an invitation to curiosity that led to consecration. Driven by a need he could no longer ignore, Eli left the stacks of books and exited the library. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, the sounds of the city a distant hum. He walked without a clear destination, his feet carrying him away from the academic quad and toward a forgotten corner of the campus, a small walled garden that had been donated by a benefactor long ago and was now mostly overlooked. He pushed open the heavy wooden gate, its iron latch cool in his hand. The garden was a pocket of profound quiet. Overgrown rose bushes spilled their last fragrant blooms onto gravel paths. A gnarled ancient oak stood sentinel in the center, its leaves casting a dappled shifting shade. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and lavender. It was not majestic, but it was peaceful, a sanctuary of neglect. Eli found a weathered stone bench beneath the oak and sat, the coolness of the stone seeping through his clothes. He closed his eyes and did nothing. He did not pray formal words. He did not wrestle with theological concepts. He simply sat, breathing in the quiet, allowing the stillness to settle around him like a soft cloak. He listened to the sounds of the garden, the buzz of a lone bee, the rustle of a sparrow in the leaves, the faint whisper of the breeze. He felt the sun's warmth on his closed eyelids, the solid reality of the bench beneath him, and in that simple, intentional act of presence, he felt a shift. The frantic, churning thoughts in his mind began to slow, their sharp edges softening. The heavy weight of grief, while still present, felt less like a crushing burden and more like a settled companion. It was as if the very air around him was charged with a gentle, waiting attention. He was not expecting a voice from a burning rose bush. He was not expecting any dramatic revelation. But in the quiet of that garden, he felt a similar call to the one Moses had received, not to lead a nation out of slavery, but to listen for the divine in the rustle of leaves, in the scent of lavender, in the beating of his own imperfect heart. The burning bush was not a one-time event locked in antiquity. It was a paradigm. God was still speaking, still revealing himself in the ordinary, unconsumed moments of daily life, if one had the eyes to see the fire and the ears to hear the voice. The holy ground was not just a patch of desert sand. It was any place where a soul chose to be present, to be bare, to be open to the possibility of the sacred. Sitting on that stone bench, Eli took off his metaphorical sandals. He stopped trying to understand God and simply tried to be with God. And in that humble, quiet garden he felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was standing on holy ground. Chapter 10. The Parting of the Sea. The trap was absolute, a perfect confluence of geography and human malice. Eli read the 14th chapter of Exodus, and the terror of the Israelites was a cold, palpable thing that seeped from the page. They were encamped by the sea, the vast, impassable expanse of water before them, a shimmering blue barrier to freedom. Behind them, the dust cloud of Pharaoh's chariots churned on the horizon, a dark, approaching storm of bronze and vengeance. The Egyptian army, the most powerful military force in the world, was closing in, and the recently freed slaves were cornered, a flock of panicked sheep with nowhere to run. Their cry went up to Moses, not a prayer of faith, but an accusation of despair. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? The promise of liberation was moments away from being crushed under the wheels of 600 chariots, and the only possible outcome seemed to be a massacre on the shore. Eli could feel the claustrophobic pressure of the moment, the salt spray from the sea mingling with the dust of the approaching army, the metallic taste of fear in every mouth. He saw Moses standing before the people, his own heart surely hammering against his ribs, raising his staff not as a weapon, but as a declaration into the face of the impossible. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The command was audacious, a demand for faith when every physical sense screamed for flight. Then came the divine instruction that defied all tactical logic. Tell the Israelites to move on. To move on? Into the water? Into the deadly embrace of the sea? It was a command that must have sounded like madness. But then the miracle began. It did not start with a cataclysm, but with a shift in the atmosphere. A pillar of cloud, which had been leading them, moved from the front to the rear, standing between the camps of Israel and Egypt. To the Israelites, it was a barrier of light, a divine shield casting a reassuring glow. To the Egyptians, it was a wall of impenetrable, swirling darkness, confounding their advance and halting their charge. The universe itself was taking sides. And then, as the night wore on, Moses stretched his hand over the sea. A strong east wind began to blow, sent by the Lord. Eli imagined it, not as a gentle breeze, but as a roaring, relentless gale, a force of nature harnessed for a single, precise purpose. All that night, the wind pushed against the waters, a divine pressure that carved a path through the very heart of the deep. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The impossible path was open, a corridor of damp sand and exposed seabed through the towering liquid cliffs. Eli's mind was reeling, the image of that impossible highway blazing in his imagination. The fear of the people, the blinding darkness for the Egyptians, the roaring wind, and the gradual, terrifyingly beautiful parting of the waters. It was a symphony of deliverance composed in the key of desperation. This was not a God who merely provided a way around an obstacle. He was a God who created a way through it. The very thing that had been their certain death, the sea, became the instrument of their salvation. The path to freedom led directly into the heart of what they feared most. As the vision of the parted sea shimmered in his mind, it dissolved into a memory from his own life, a moment of feeling just as trapped and hopeless. It was in the immediate gray aftermath of his mother's funeral. The grief had been a vast, trackless ocean, and he was adrift in the middle of it, with no shore in sight. The future was a blank, terrifying wall of water. His faith, which had always been his compass, felt shattered, its pieces lying amid the wreckage of his sorrow. He was trapped between the crushing memory of his loss and the terrifying emptiness of a life without her. Every direction seemed to lead only to more pain, more of the same suffocating sadness. He had felt the chariots of despair closing in, the certainty that this was his new permanent reality, a prisoner in the land of grief. In that desperate place, he had done the only thing he could think to do, the thing that felt as irrational as walking into the sea. He had opened his Bible, not to study, not to deconstruct, but to grope for a lifeline in the dark. His fingers had fumbled to the Psalms, to the raw, angry, hopeful cries of people who also felt abandoned and trapped. He had read the words, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord," and they had been his own cry. It was a small, seemingly foolish act, like raising a staff over an ocean of sorrow. But in that act of desperate, stubborn faith, something had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic parting of the waters, but a subtle quieting of the storm inside him. A path, narrow and fragile, had begun to appear through the overwhelming waves of his grief. It was the path of simply putting one foot in front of the other, of showing up to his classes, of writing one more sentence in his journal, of breathing in and out when every breath felt like a betrayal. It was a way through, not a way out, carved not by a roaring wind, but by a whispered prayer and the fragile decision to trust that even in the deepest sea, a path could exist. The miracle of the Red Sea was not just a historical event. It was a promise etched into the fabric of reality that when faced with an impossible barrier, faith could, against all reason, make a way. The seabed was a highway of damp, packed earth, a path carved through the impossible, flanked by towering, shimmering walls of water that defied gravity and sense. The Israelites moved forward, a river of humanity flowing between liquid cliffs, their footsteps silent on the strange, dry ground. The only sounds were the muffled roar of the contained sea, the frantic lowing of livestock, and the sharp, fearful breaths of a people walking through the heart of their deepest terror. Eli pictured the scene in vivid, trembling detail, the unearthly green light filtering through the suspended water, the fish and other sea creatures trapped like floating jewels in the crystalline walls, the sheer, vertiginous awe of stepping into a space that should have been their tomb. This was not an escape. It was a baptism into a new kind of trust, a visceral, step-by-step lesson in walking by faith and not by sight. Each footfall on the exposed seabed was a confirmation of a promise that had seemed like madness on the shore. Then came the Egyptians. Blinded by rage and pride, they drove their chariots onto the same miraculous path, the wheels of their arrogance churning the divine highway into a mire. In the pre-dawn gloom, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian army into a panic. He clogged their chariot wheels, making them drive with difficulty. The same path that had been a corridor of deliverance for the faithful became a trap of confusion for the faithless. The cry went up from the army, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." But it was too late. As the last Israelite set foot on the far shore, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea once more. The east wind ceased. The divine restraint was lifted. With a roar that must have shaken the foundations of the world, the walls of water collapsed. The sea rushed back into its place, a cataclysmic avalanche of liquid judgment, swallowing chariots, horses, and men whole. Not one of them survived. The might of Egypt, the power that had held a nation in bondage for centuries, was extinguished in a single, devastating moment, its remnants washing up on the shore as silent, waterlogged proof of a deliverance that was both terrible and complete. Eli sat in the profound silence that followed the narrative's climax, the echo of the crashing waves still reverberating in his spirit. He reflected on the stark duality of the story. The same sea that was salvation for one was destruction for another. The difference was not in the sea, but in the trust placed in the one who commanded it. The Israelites had walked through their fear, however tentatively, and found deliverance. The Egyptians had charged into their pride and found only a watery grave. It was a sobering lesson on the nature of divine intervention. It was a shield for the faithful and a sword against the obstinate. The trust that had felt so fragile on the shore was, in the end, the only thing that made the path solid beneath their feet. This lesson in trust began to seek a practical outlet in Eli's own life. His thesis research was entering its most demanding phase, a sea of complex source analysis and dense theological argument that sometimes felt as impassable as the Red Sea. It was during one of his long late-night sessions in the library that he noticed a younger student of first year named Caleb looking similarly overwhelmed. Caleb was hunched over a stack of commentaries on the Pentateuch, his face a mask of frustration and exhaustion. Eli recognized the look. It was the same expression he imagined on the Israelites' faces as they saw the Egyptian chariots bearing down, the look of someone trapped with no way out. Remembering the mentorship he had received from Professor Adams and others, Eli felt a quiet nudge, a call to stretch out his own small staff over someone else's sea. He walked over and introduced himself. Caleb looked up, startled, then relieved to have his isolation broken. He confessed he was struggling with a specific paper on the Covenant Code, drowning in a flood of conflicting interpretations and his own insecurities. The academic challenge was his personal Red Sea, and he saw no path through it. Eli pulled up a chair. He did not give Caleb the answers. Instead, he began to ask questions, guiding him to break down the massive, intimidating topic into smaller, manageable parts. He showed him how to identify the key themes, how to compare scholarly viewpoints without being overwhelmed by them, how to build an argument one solid brick at a time. He shared his own experiences of feeling lost in research, of the times his own intellectual chariot wheels had gotten stuck. He was, in essence, helping Caleb see that the sea could be parted. He was pointing out the dry ground that lay between the towering walls of academic pressure. He was teaching him to trust the process, to take the first step and then the next. Over the next hour, Caleb's posture changed. The frantic despair eased from his shoulders, replaced by a focused determination. He began to map out his paper, his pen moving with newfound confidence. The impossible had become possible. The sea was parting. Watching him, Eli felt a profound sense of purpose that went beyond his own academic pursuits. He had been a conduit of deliverance, however small. He had helped someone navigate their fear and find a path forward. In mentoring Caleb, he was living out the very trust he was studying, the belief that no challenge, whether a pursuing army or an impossible paper, was beyond the reach of a grace that could make a way where there was no way. The Israelites had crossed on dry ground, and in a quiet corner of the library, a young student was learning to do the same, his own personal exodus beginning with the simple, courageous act of putting one foot in front of the other on a path he could not see until someone showed him it was there. Chapter 11. Rahab's Faith. The walls of Jericho were not merely stone and mortar. They were a symbol of impregnable power, a fortress of fear that had held a nation in psychological thrall for generations. Yet within those very walls, in a house built into the barrier itself, lived a woman whose profession made her an outcast among her own people. Eli read the 2nd and 6th chapters of Joshua, and the story of Rahab unfolded not as a tale of military strategy, but as a stunning portrait of faith blooming in the most unlikely and scorned of soils. She was a prostitute, a woman living on the margins of society, her name a byword for shame. Yet when the 2 Israelite spies appeared at her door, she did not see enemies. She saw the hand of the God of heaven. The terror of the Lord had fallen upon Jericho, a dread born of the stories of the Red Sea and the victories over Sihon and Og. And while her countrymen's hearts melted with fear, Rahab's heart awakened to a desperate, courageous hope. Eli pictured her home, perched precariously on the great wall, a place of transient encounters now transformed into a sanctuary for divine messengers. He saw her boldness as she hid the spies under the stalks of flax drying on her roof, her quick thinking as she sent the king's men on a false chase. But the true centerpiece of the story was her confession, a theological declaration that would have been remarkable from a priest, let alone a Canaanite prostitute. "I know that the Lord has given you this land," she told the spies, "for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." Her faith was not based on a long lineage or ritual purity, but on a clear-eyed recognition of the power and sovereignty of the God of Israel. It was a faith that compelled her to risk everything, her life, her home, her precarious standing, to align herself with this God. In return, she asked for a promise of salvation for herself and her family. A scarlet cord hung from her window as a sign of the covenant between a faithful God and a faith-filled woman. Weeks later, Eli read of the culmination of that faith. The Israelite army marched around Jericho for 6 days in a silent, bewildering procession. On the 7th day, they marched 7 times, and at the sound of the trumpets and the people's shout, the mighty walls crumbled into dust. But one section remained standing, the house of Rahab, marked by the scarlet cord. As the city fell into chaos and judgment, the spies entered and brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her. They were brought to safety outside the camp of Israel, their lives spared because of the faith of one marginalized woman. She, who had been an outsider in her own city, was grafted into the lineage of Israel. Her story forever etched into the narrative of God's redemptive plan. Eli leaned back, deeply moved. Rahab's story was a powerful antidote to any lingering notion that God's grace was reserved for the morally upright or the religiously orthodox. Her faith, born in a brothel on the wrong side of the wall, was celebrated in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews. Her courage, despite her past, demonstrated that no one was beyond the reach of God's redemptive purpose. He saw in her a reflection of the divine preference for the overlooked, the same pattern he had witnessed with Ehud's left-handedness and the talking donkey. God's grace was not deterred by social stigma or a checkered history. It was drawn to a heart that recognized him, no matter how unlikely the vessel. The following afternoon, as Eli walked across campus, he saw a man he often passed but had never truly seen. His name was Leo, and he spent his days on a bench near the theology building, his worldly possessions contained in 2 worn bags beside him. Leo was part of the landscape, a silent, marginalized figure most students hurried past. But today, Eli saw him through the lens of Rahab's story. He saw not just a homeless man, but a person with a story, with fears and hopes, a man who might, in his own way, be looking for a scarlet cord of hope. Instead of walking by, Eli stopped. He sat on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance. "Beautiful day," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Leo looked up, his eyes wary but not unkind. He nodded slowly. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the sounds of the campus swirling around them. Then Eli simply asked, "How are you holding up?" It was not a profound question, but it was an invitation. And slowly, Haltingly, Leo began to talk. He spoke of a series of misfortunes, a lost job, a broken family, a descent into a depression that left him isolated. He wasn't asking for anything, just telling his story to someone who had chosen to listen. Eli didn't offer advice or empty platitudes. He just listened, his own problems shrinking in the face of Leo's quiet dignity in the midst of struggle. Before he left, Eli bought 2 coffees from a nearby cart and handed one to Leo. It was a small thing, a token, but as he walked away, he felt the significance of the moment. He had seen God's grace in an unlikely place, not in a stained glass window, but in the weary eyes of a man on a park bench. He had, in his own small way, offered a scarlet cord of human connection, a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity that felt like a sacred act. Rahab's faith had saved her household, and in reaching out to Leo, Eli felt his own faith stretching, growing more compassionate, more attuned to the whispers of grace in the shadows of the world. Chapter 12. Jael's Tent, Peg. The battlefield's roar had faded, replaced by the frantic sucking sound of a single man's flight through mud and terror. Sisera, commander of the Canaanite army, ran. His iron chariots, the pride of King Jabin's might, were useless mires in the flooded Kishon, and his soldiers lay scattered like broken toys behind him. He ran toward what he thought was sanctuary, the tent of Heber the Kenite, an ally of his king. Eli read the 4th chapter of Judges, and the tension coiled in his stomach like a serpent. The narrative shifted from the broad chaos of war to the intimate, suffocating space of a nomadic tent, where deliverance would come not from a soldier's sword, but from a housewife's hand. He saw Jael emerge from the tent's dark opening, her figure a silhouette against the goat hair cloth. She saw the disheveled, panting general, his eyes wild with the animal fear of a hunted thing. With a calm that was more terrifying than any battle cry, she stepped out to meet him. "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." Her voice was a balm, a promise of safety in the wilderness. She led him into the tent's dim, wool-scented interior and covered him with a rug, a gesture of maternal protection that was a perfect, deadly lie. When he asked for water, she gave him milk, a richer, more comforting drink, and in his exhaustion he drank deeply, the lactic haze pulling him toward the oblivion of sleep. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he mumbled, his words slurred with trust and fatigue. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." Then came the wait. Eli could feel the thick, silent tension inside the tent. The only sound Sisera's deepening breaths as he fell into a profound, unsuspecting slumber, and the quiet, steady beat of Jael's heart. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. Her hands, accustomed to the daily rhythms of pitching tents and securing homes, found the tools of her trade, a tent peg and a hammer. They were not weapons of war, but instruments of domesticity, of building and securing. In Jael's hands, they were about to become the instruments of divine judgment. Eli's breath caught as he read the next stark sentence. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer. While he was sleeping soundly, she drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. The violence was sudden, intimate, and brutally efficient. There was no struggle, no grand confrontation, just the soft thud of a hammer on wood, the wet, sickening crunch of bone and brain, and the immediate stillness of death. The mighty Sisera, the terror of Israel, was pinned to the earth by a woman with a piece of sharpened wood. A wave of revulsion washed over Eli. This was not the glorious sun-stopped victory of Joshua or the dramatic drowning of Pharaoh's army. This was assassination, a violation of hospitality, an act of gruesome close-quarters murder. He wanted to look away from the text, to dismiss it as a barbaric relic. But as the initial shock subsided, a colder, more complex understanding began to dawn. This was not random violence. This was divine justice, executed through the most unexpected of agents. Deborah the prophetess had foretold that the Lord would sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Jael was not a rogue murderer. She was the specific chosen instrument of Israel's deliverance. The tent peg was not a weapon of treachery, but the sword of the Lord, wielded by a woman who had the courage to act when the moment demanded it. The violence was shocking because the oppression had been absolute. Sisera's death was the sharp, necessary end to a long season of terror. The story's unsettling power followed Eli out of the library and into the common area of his dormitory. He saw a familiar scene unfolding. Mark, a larger, louder student, was publicly mocking a quieter first-year student named Ben for a stutter that emerged when he was nervous. The laughter of Mark's friends was a cruel chorus, and Ben's face was a mask of hot humiliation. Eli felt the old, familiar urge to look away, to avoid confrontation, to tell himself it wasn't his business. The memory of Sisera's violent end flashed in his mind, a stark contrast to the petty but real cruelty in front of him. But then he thought of Jael. Her strength was not in physical might, but in discernment and decisive action. She had used the tools she had to address the threat before her. Eli did not have a tent peg, but he had words. He did not have a hammer, but he had a presence. Walking over, he positioned himself calmly between Mark and Ben. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw a punch or issue a threat. He simply looked at Mark and said, his tone even and firm, "We're better than this. It takes no strength to mock someone. Let it go." The words were simple, but they were driven by a conviction that felt new and solid within him. They were his tent peg, a precise, targeted intervention aimed at the temple of the bully's pride. The laughter died. Mark, surprised by the direct, quiet challenge, scowled, but found no witty retort. The spell of his meanness was broken. He muttered something and turned away, his friends dispersing with him. Ben looked at Eli, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "Thanks," he whispered, the stutter absent in his relief. It was a small victory, a skirmish in a dormitory, not a war against a Canaanite general. But the principal felt the same. Eli had stood up, not with the brute force of a Samson, but with the wise, calculated courage of a Jael. He had used what he had, his voice, his conviction, his willingness to step into an uncomfortable space, to deliver a measure of justice. He saw that divine justice was not always about cataclysmic acts of power. Sometimes it was about the quiet, courageous choices of ordinary people to confront the small, everyday tyrannies, using wisdom as their weapon and integrity as their hammer. Chapter 13, The Widow's Oil. The knock on the prophet's door was not the sound of a fist, but the echo of a life collapsing in on itself. Eli read the 4th chapter of 2 Kings, and the widow's desperation was a tangible presence in the room, a cold draft of fear and impending ruin. Her husband, one of the sons of the prophets, was dead, and his debts remained. a chain of obligation that now threatened to enslave her 2 sons. The creditor was merciless, his patience exhausted, and the only currency left was the flesh and blood of her children. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of her empty home and the looming shadow of the debt collector. Her plea to Elisha was not for wealth or comfort, but for the most basic of dignities, the preservation of what little family she had left. "Your servant, my husband, is dead," she cried, "and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Eli felt the weight of her powerlessness, the cruel irony that her husband's faithfulness had not built a hedge of protection around his family. He saw Elisha's response, not with gold or a letter of intervention, but with a question that must have seemed absurd in the face of such tangible need. "What do you have in your house?" The answer was a testament to her utter destitution. "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a small jar of olive oil." A single small jar. In the grand economy of kings and creditors, it was nothing, a condiment, a trifle. It was the last pathetic remnant of a household, a symbol of how far she had fallen. But the prophet saw in that small jar the seed of a miracle. His instructions were specific, strange, and demanded an audacious act of faith. Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Eli pictured the scene, the widow, her heart a tumult of hope and skepticism, going from door to door in her village, collecting not food or money, but empty vessels. The neighbors must have wondered at her madness, this woman on the brink of disaster, gathering up useless hollow containers. Yet she obeyed. She and her sons gathered jars until there was not a single one left to be found, filling the small house with the silent gaping mouths of potential. Then, behind the closed door, the miracle began. It was not a spectacle of lightning or earthquake, but a quiet, steady act of divine multiplication. The widow took her 1 small jar, the sum total of her earthly wealth, and began to pour. The oil, which should have been exhausted after filling 1 or 2 vessels, kept flowing. It streamed from her jar in a golden, unceasing river, filling the first jar, then the second, then the 10th. The air would have grown thick with the rich, grassy scent of olive oil, a fragrance of pure abundance. Her sons kept bringing her jars, their initial confusion turning to wide-eyed wonder as jar after jar was filled to the brim. The miracle continued until every last vessel was full. Only then, when there was no more capacity to receive, did the oil stop. The small jar in her hand was likely still full, a permanent, tangible reminder that what she had offered to God, however meager, had been more than enough. Elisha's final instruction was the practical culmination of the supernatural. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." The widow, who had entered the prophet's presence with nothing but a plea, now possessed a small fortune, a literal houseful of valuable commodity. The oil that had saved her sons from slavery would now provide for their future. The miracle was one of precise, overflowing provision, meeting her exact need and then exceeding it. God had not sent a sudden windfall from the sky. He had taken the one small, seemingly insignificant thing she already possessed and multiplied it beyond her wildest imaginings. Eli closed the Bible, the image of the steadily flowing oil imprinted on his mind. He was deeply moved, not just by the power of the miracle, but by its intimate, domestic nature. This was a God who concerned himself with creditors and kitchen jars, with the terror of a mother and the fate of her children. The story was a profound lesson in the economy of heaven, where small things, when surrendered in faith, could become catalysts for abundance. It was a theme that resonated with the core of his thesis, the divine preference for the humble and the overlooked. Later that day, as he scrolled through the news on his phone, a small headline caught his eye. A local charity, the City Kitchen, was facing a severe shortage. They provided hot meals for the homeless and struggling families, but donations had dried up, and they were on the verge of cutting back their services. The article featured a quote from the director, a weary-looking woman named Sarah, who said, "Sometimes it feels like we're trying to feed a multitude with just a few loaves and fishes." The metaphor struck Eli with the force of a personal call. He thought of the widow's small jar of oil. He thought of his own resources, which felt meager, a modest student stipend, a small savings account meant for emergencies. He opened his banking app, his thumb hovering over the screen. The rational part of his mind protested. His donation would be a drop in the bucket, a single jar in a sea of need. It wouldn't solve their problem. It was, in the grand scheme, nothing. But the story of the widow whispered a different truth. It wasn't about the size of the gift, but the faith behind it. It was about taking the little one has and trusting that God could multiply it. He typed in an amount that felt significant to him, a sum that meant sacrificing a few comforts for the month, and clicked Donate. It was his small jar of oil. He didn't expect a miracle, but he acted in the hope that his small act, combined with the small acts of others, could create a tide of provision. A week later, he received a thank you email from the City Kitchen. It wasn't a form letter. It mentioned that their story had been picked up by a local news station after a donor had shared it, and a sudden, unexpected influx of donations had come in, not just covering their shortfall, but allowing them to expand their services for the coming winter. They were, the director wrote, overwhelmed by the way a little has become so much. Reading those words, Eli felt a quiet, profound warmth spread through his chest. He had not multiplied oil in his apartment, but he had participated in a modern-day version of the same principle. His small, faithful act had been joined with countless others, and together they had become a river of provision for those in need. He experienced, in a deeply personal way, how God could take the small jars of our lives, our limited time, our modest resources, our simple acts of obedience, and pour them out into a miracle of multiplied blessing. The widow's oil was still flowing, not in a single clay jar, but through the willing, open hands of those who trusted that what they had, however little, was enough for God to use. Chapter 14. The Fiery Furnace. The king's pride was a forge, and his golden statue a monument to its searing heat. But the true fire was the one he would later stoke in a desperate attempt to burn away defiance. Eli read the 3rd chapter of Daniel, and the scene unfolded with the stark, theatrical grandeur of absolute power confronting unshakable faith. King Nebuchadnezzar, his ego swollen with dreams of empire, commanded that at the sound of the royal orchestra, every nation and tongue must fall down and worship the 90-foot golden image he had erected on the plain of Dura. The penalty for refusal was as absolute as the command itself. A fiery furnace, stoked 7 times hotter than usual, a death so terrifying it was meant to incinerate not just bodies, but the very will to descend. Eli pictured the 3 Hebrew men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, standing apart from the prostrate multitude. Their bodies were rigid, not with fear, but with resolution. They were surrounded by the cacophony of sycophantic worship and the threatening silence of their own refusal. The Chaldeans, their faces sharp with malice, reported their disobedience to the king, relishing the coming conflagration. Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and wounded pride, gave them one final chance, his offer laced with a tyrant's arrogance. "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Their reply was not a negotiation, but a declaration that echoed through the corridors of power and eternity. It was a faith that did not demand a guarantee of deliverance. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. The word struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. Their faith was not conditional upon their rescue. It was rooted in the character of God himself, a trust that held fast whether the outcome was miraculous deliverance or martyrdom. They were prepared to walk into the fire for their God, even if he did not walk with them in a way they could see. The king's fury was a visible inferno. He ordered the furnace heated to its most extreme temperature, so fierce that the soldiers who bound the 3 men and threw them in were themselves killed by the blistering flames. Eli's mind recoiled from the imagined horror, the roar of the superheated air, the searing pain, the certain agonizing death. But then the narrative pivoted into the impossible. The king, peering into the heart of the blaze, leaped to his feet in astonishment. "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" he asked his advisers. His eyes were not deceiving him. There were now 4 figures walking around unharmed, unbound, in the center of the furnace. And the 4th, he declared, looked like a son of the gods. The fire had not touched them. Not a hair was singed, their robes were unsullied, and they did not even smell of smoke. The only things the flames had consumed were the ropes that bound them. The story was a testament to a faith that could walk into the fire and find a divine presence waiting within it. God had not prevented the trial. He had entered into it with them. The furnace intended for their destruction had become the very place where his power was most gloriously revealed. Their trust had not been a shield against the fire, but an invitation for God to meet them in the midst of it, transforming a place of execution into a sanctuary. The resonance of this story began to burn in Eli's own life with an uncomfortable intensity. His turn to present his thesis proposal to the entire theology department was fast approaching. It was not a fiery furnace, but to Eli, the podium in the large wood-paneled lecture hall felt just as terrifying. The fear of public speaking was a deep, ingrained phobia, a cold dread that had gripped him since a humiliating middle school presentation. The thought of standing before his professors and peers, of his voice cracking, his mind going blank, of being intellectually dismantled, was a psychological fire that threatened to consume his confidence. He had managed to avoid it for years, but now it was unavoidable. For days he practiced in his room, his words sounding hollow and rehearsed to his own ears. The old, familiar panic began to rise, a heat of anxiety spreading through his chest. He was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bound by the cords of his own fear and thrown toward the flames of public scrutiny. On the morning of the presentation, his hands were clammy, his stomach a tight knot. He prayed, not for the fear to be taken away, but for the strength to walk through it. He prayed for the presence of the fourth figure in his own furnace, a calmness that was not his own. When his name was called, he walked to the podium, his legs feeling like wood. The faces of his professors and fellow students were a blur. He took a deep breath, clicked to his first slide, and began to speak. His voice was shaky at first, but as he started to explain the thesis of his work, the pattern of divine purpose in the bizarre and unexpected, a strange thing happened. The words began to flow. The tightness in his chest eased. He wasn't thinking about himself anymore. He was thinking about the stories, about the talking donkey and the floating axe head and the faith of the three men in the furnace. He was sharing not just an academic argument, but the journey of his own heart. He felt a presence, a steadying hand on his spirit, a peace that defied his circumstances. He was in the fire, but he was not being burned. The ropes of his anxiety fell away. He finished to a respectful silence, followed by a smattering of applause and a series of thoughtful, engaging questions. He had walked through it. He had trusted that God would be with him, and he had been. The deliverance was not from the trial itself, but in the grace to endure it and emerge unscathed. His confidence not in his own eloquence, but in the truth he had been given to share. Chapter 15, The Lion's Den. The decree was a snare, a piece of parchment woven from the silk of envy and sealed with the wax of absolute power, designed to entrap the one man in the kingdom whose integrity was as unshakable as the foundations of the earth. Eli read the 6th chapter of Daniel, and the political machinations unfolded with a chilling familiarity. The satraps and administrators, their pride pricked by Daniel's excellence and the king's favor, could find no corruption in him, no negligence, no flaw to exploit. His life was a seamless garment of faithfulness. So they attacked the source of that faithfulness itself, crafting a law that made prayer to any god or man other than King Darius a capital offense, punishable by being thrown into a den of lions. They knew Daniel would not bend. They were counting on the unyielding nature of his devotion to be the very thing that broke him. Eli pictured the scene in Daniel's upper room, the windows open toward Jerusalem, as was his custom. The law was signed, irrevocable, under the laws of the Medes and Persians. Daniel knew the consequences. He could have closed the shutters, prayed in silence, hidden his faith for 30 days to survive. But his faith was not a private hobby. It was the axis upon which his entire life turned. So he knelt, as he always had, 3 times a day, and prayed, giving thanks to his God. The spies watched, their hearts doubtless leaping with triumph at the sight of this old man's stubborn piety. They reported to the king, and Darius, realizing too late he had been manipulated, was trapped by his own decree. His distress was palpable. He had valued Daniel, and now he was forced to condemn him. The stone was rolled over the mouth of the den, sealing the prophet in with the beasts, and the king spent a sleepless night fasting, his music silenced, his own palace a cage of regret. But in the den, a different reality was unfolding. Eli's mind journeyed into that pit, a place of damp stone and the musky scent of predator. The lions would have been restless, their eyes gleaming in the dim light, their low growls rumbling through the confined space. Daniel, an old man, would have been an easy morsel. Yet, as the night wore on, no sound of tearing flesh or pained cry echoed from the pit. An angel had been sent. Eli imagined the celestial being, not with wings perhaps, but with a presence that commanded the animal kingdom, shutting the mouths of the lions, turning their instinct to devour into a compelled, bewildered peace. Daniel spent the night not in a fight for survival, but in the company of a divine guardian, surrounded by creatures that had become as docile as lambs. His faith had not saved him from the den, but it had transformed the den itself. The place of certain death had become a sanctuary under the jurisdiction of heaven. At the first light of dawn, the king hurried to the pit, his voice cracking with a hope that defied reason. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And from the darkness came the reply, clear and unwavering, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight." The relief that washed over Darius must have been a physical force. Daniel was lifted out, unscathed, not a scratch on him. The king's justice then turned upon the accusers. They and their families were cast into the very den they had prepared for Daniel, and the lions, their muzzles no longer divinely restrained, proved how real the threat had been. The story concluded with a royal decree that exalted the God of Daniel across the empire, a faith born in a lion's den, echoing through the halls of power. Eli closed the Bible, the image of Daniel's serene faith in the face of certain death, burning in his mind. It was a story about the cost of integrity and the reward of unwavering trust. Daniel had chosen faithfulness over safety, and in doing so had witnessed a deliverance that cemented his God's reputation in a pagan land. The lions were real, the threat was mortal, but his trust in God was more real still. This lesson in integrity began to press upon Eli with an immediate, personal weight. He was in the final frantic stages of writing his thesis. The arguments were complex, the source material vast and sometimes contradictory. One afternoon, as he was compiling his analysis of the bizarre narratives, he found himself facing a significant ethical dilemma. A particular obscure scholarly article he had read months ago, written by a relatively unknown theologian, presented a compelling interpretation of the Balaam story that perfectly supported a key point Eli was trying to make. The author's insight was brilliant, a thread that could tie several of his chapters together. In his haste and excitement, he began to weave that interpretation into his own work. It was only later, as he was formatting his footnotes, that he realized with a sinking feeling he had inadvertently paraphrased several of the article's most unique phrases without proper attribution. It wasn't a direct copy, but the intellectual DNA was unmistakably the same. He had crossed the line from being influenced to appropriating another's original thought. The easy answer beckoned, a seductive whisper. No one would likely notice. The article was obscure. He could slightly reword the passages again, muddying the source, and no one would be the wiser. It would make his thesis stronger, his argument more cohesive. It was the path of least resistance, the way to avoid the academic lions of scrutiny and potential accusation of plagiarism. But then he thought of Daniel, kneeling at his open window, fully aware of the decree, fully aware of the den. Daniel had not chosen the easy path. He had chosen the right path, even when it led directly into danger. His integrity was not situational, it was the core of his identity. Eli looked at his screen, at the beautifully argued paragraphs that were not entirely his own. They felt like a lie, a patch of borrowed finery, sewn onto the garment of his own work. To leave them as they were would be to build his thesis on a foundation of intellectual dishonesty. It would be a betrayal of the very faith he was exploring, a faith that valued truth above convenience. With a sigh that felt like the release of a great weight, he opened a new document. He selected the compromise sections and hit delete. The words vanished from the screen, and with them a certain polished elegance in his argument. Then he began to write again. This time he credited the original author with a full citation, acknowledging the debt of the idea. He then worked to build his own, more laborious path to the same conclusion, using his own voice, his own analysis, his own hard-won insights. The resulting text was rougher, less flashy, but it was his. It was honest. He had chosen to walk into the den of a weaker argument rather than stay in the safety of a stolen one. And in that choice, he felt a peace that was its own kind of deliverance. The lions of academic failure might still prowl, but his integrity, like Daniel's, remained unharmed. He had learned that true faith was not just about believing God could shut the mouths of lions, but about having the courage to walk into the den with your integrity intact, trusting that the outcome, whatever it was in the hands of the one who held the keys. Chapter 16, Naaman's Leprosy. The general's pride was a fortress, its walls built from years of victory and the unassailable respect of a king. But the fissure in its foundation was a patch of pale, dead flesh that no amount of armor could conceal. Eli read the 5th chapter of 2 Kings, and the story of Naaman unfolded as a study in the collision of human prestige and divine protocol. Here was a man, commander of the army of Aram, a great man and highly regarded, a valiant soldier, yet a leper. His power, his influence, his very identity were shadowed by a creeping, incurable disease that made him an outsider in his own skin. Salvation came from the most humble of sources, a captive Israelite girl serving his wife, whose simple faith pointed toward a prophet in Samaria. The king of Aram, in a gesture of grandiose diplomacy, sent Naaman with a letter and a king's ransom in silver, gold, and clothing, expecting a royal audience and a dramatic healing. Eli could not help but laugh, a soft, understanding sound in the quiet library, as he read of Naaman's arrival at Elisha's door. The general, accustomed to pomp and ceremony, rolled up in his chariots and horses, his retinue impressive, his treasure gleaming. He expected the prophet to come out, to wave his hand over the spot, to call upon his God with theatrical fervor. Instead, Elisha did not even bother to greet him. He sent a messenger with instructions so absurdly simple they felt like an insult. Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. Naaman's rage was a predictable human fire. He stormed away. His pride scalded. The rivers of Damascus, the Abana and the Pharpar, were better than all the waters of Israel. Could he not wash in them and be clean? The prescription was beneath him. The method was an affront to his status. He had come for a spectacle and was offered a bath. But then his servants, those with nothing to lose but their master, approached him with a quiet, devastating logic. "My father," they said, "if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more, then, when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" The words were a key that turned in the lock of Naaman's stubborn heart. Eli saw the moment of surrender, the great general dismounting from his chariot of pride, stripping off his robes of office, and walking down the muddy bank of the insignificant Jordan River. The first dip was an act of humiliation. The second, an exercise in patience. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, a test of a faith that was being born in the act of obedience itself. And on the seventh immersion, as he rose from the water, he looked at his flesh. It was restored, like the flesh of a young boy. The leprosy was gone, not just healed, but reborn. The simple, humble act, performed in the most mundane of rivers, had accomplished what all the wealth and power of Aram could not. The story was a master class in the divine preference for humility over grandeur. God had bypassed kings and treasure to use a slave girl's testimony and a river's water. He had required not a great feat, but humble submission. Naaman's healing was as much spiritual as it was physical. The leprosy of his pride was washed away along with the disease of his skin. He emerged from the Jordan not only clean, but converted. His declaration, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," a testament to a faith forged in the waters of self-abasement. Eli leaned back, the lesson settling deep within him. He saw his own reflection in Naaman's initial pride. His own journey had been marked by stubborn self-reliance, a belief that he could think his way through grief, that he could, through the sheer force of his own intellect and will, resolve the tangled mess of his emotions and his faith. He had treated his pain as a complex theological problem to be solved, rather than a wound that needed the simple, humbling balm of grace. He had been waiting for a dramatic, Elisha-like intervention, a parting of the seas of his sorrow, when perhaps the answer lay in a simpler, more mundane act of surrender. The memory of a recent tangled situation with his roommate surfaced. A misunderstanding over shared bills and cleaning duties had festered into a weeks-long Cold War, a silent, passive-aggressive standoff that had turned their shared apartment into a tense, uncomfortable space. Eli had replayed the argument in his head countless times, fortifying his own position, cataloging his roommate's faults. He had been waiting for an apology, for a grand gesture that would reset the balance. He had been Naaman, expecting the healing of their relationship to come through a dramatic, righteous confrontation. But the story of the Jordan River whispered a different way. Healing could come through humility. It could come from washing in the simple, unglamorous waters of an apology, of asking for help, of admitting his own part in the conflict. The thought of being the one to break the silence felt as humiliating to his pride as dipping in the Jordan had been for Naaman. It meant laying down his weapons, making himself vulnerable. That evening, he found his roommate, David, in the kitchen, his back turned as he made a sandwich. The air was thick with unspoken words. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He took a breath, the weight of his pride a heavy cloak he had to consciously shrug off. "David," he said, his voice softer than he intended, I've been thinking about the mess and the bills. I'm sorry for my part in it. I've been stubborn. I should have talked to you sooner. I need your help to figure this out." The words hung in the air. David turned slowly, his expression one of surprise, then cautious relief. The defensive wall in his eyes crumbled. "Yeah," he said, letting out a long breath. "Me too. I've been a jerk about it. Let's just start over." They sat at the small kitchen table and, for the first time in weeks, had a calm, productive conversation. They made a new chore chart, sorted out the bills, and even shared a laugh about the absurdity of their silent war. The tension that had plagued their home dissolved, replaced by a tentative but genuine peace. It was not a dramatic reconciliation, but a quiet, practical healing. As they talked, Eli felt the truth of Naaman's story settle in his spirit. He had humbled himself, he had asked for help, and in doing so, he had experienced a restoration of relationship that felt every bit as miraculous as the cleansing of leprous skin. The Jordan River was not just a body of water in the ancient Near East. It was any place where pride was laid down and simple, obedient steps were taken toward wholeness. Naaman was healed in the river, and Eli, in his own small kitchen, had found a similar profound healing in the humble act of saying, "I'm sorry. I need your help." Chapter 17, The Gadarene Demoniac. The wind howled like a chorus of the damned, whipping the surface of the sea into a frenzy of white-capped fury, a perfect mirror for the storm raging within the man who lived among the tombs. Eli read the 5th chapter of Mark, and the story of the Gerasene demoniac unfolded not as a distant theological account, but as a visceral descent into a hell of fractured identity and profound isolation. This was not a man with a simple ailment. He was a man possessed by a legion of torment, his own self shattered and subsumed by a cacophony of alien voices. He lived among the dead, in the caves that served as tombs, a place of perpetual uncleanness and despair. No chain could hold him, no shackle could bind the superhuman strength born of his inner chaos. Night and day he wandered the hills, gashing himself with stones, his cries echoing through the graveyard, a living ghost trapped in a nightmare of his own skin. Eli pictured the scene as Jesus stepped from the boat onto the shore of this region of the Gerasenes. The demoniac saw him from a distance and ran to him, but not in aggression. He fell on his knees before him, and from the man's torn and bleeding lips came a voice that was not his own, a collective, desperate shriek. "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you won't torture me." The confrontation was not between a teacher and a madman, but between the author of order and the very essence of chaos. Jesus asked the simple, terrifying question, "What is your name?" The reply was a chilling admission of multiplicity and lost self. "My name is Legion," he answered, "for we are many." A Roman legion consisted of thousands of men. The man was not just troubled. He was a crowded house of despair, a living embodiment of brokenness so complete it could no longer remember its own name. The resolution was as dramatic as the condition. The legion of spirits begged not to be sent out of the area, but to be sent into a large herd of pigs feeding nearby. Jesus gave them permission. The narrative pivoted with a sudden violent surge as the unclean spirits came out and went into the pigs, about 2,000 in number. The herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. The squeals of the panicked animals, the thunder of their hooves, the churning of the water as they were swallowed by the sea. It was a cataclysmic, symbolic purging. The forces of chaos and death that had dominated the man were given over to creatures deemed unclean and were ultimately consumed by the deep. Then came the quiet. The herdsmen fled, spreading the news. When the people from the town arrived, they saw the former demoniac. He was not running, he was not screaming, he was not cutting himself. He was sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. The transformation was so absolute it was more frightening to the onlookers than his former madness had been. They were filled with fear and pleaded with Jesus to leave their region. The restored man begged to go with him, but Jesus sent him home with a mission. Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. The man who had been a byword for terror became the first evangelist to the Decapolis, proclaiming what Jesus had done for him. Eli leaned back, the power of the story settling over him like a heavy mantle. He was awed not just by the display of authority over the spiritual realm, but by the profound, intimate restoration of a single, shattered human being. This was not merely an exorcism. It was an act of recreation. The man's mind, once a battleground, was now a place of peace. His identity, once legion, was now singular and whole. Jesus had not just cast out demons, he had returned a man to himself. The story was a blazing testament to God's power to enter the deepest, most hopeless places of human brokenness and speak a word of order into the chaos, to restore a soul that everyone else had given up for lost. The image of the man, clothed and in his right mind, sitting calmly at the feet of Jesus, would not leave him. It sparked a memory of a news segment he had seen months ago about the crisis in mental health care, about the legions of people living in their own modern-day tombs of depression, anxiety, and psychosis, often isolated and misunderstood. He had changed the channel then, the topic feeling too vast, too clinical, too distant from his own world of texts and theories. But now, the story of the Gerasene and demoniac had bridged that distance. The brokenness was the same, even if its name had changed. Driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand, Eli spent the next evening researching local organizations. He found one called Haven Light, a community outreach center that offered support groups, counseling referrals, and a simple, drop-in safe space for people struggling with mental health issues. The following Tuesday, he walked through its doors, his heart thumping with a nervousness that felt trivial compared to the courage of those who came here seeking help. The air inside was warm, smelling of cheap coffee and faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. The walls were painted a soft, calming blue, and the people he saw were not spectacles or statistics, but individuals. A woman nervously twisting a tissue, a man staring into the middle distance with weary eyes, a young person who couldn't seem to stop their leg from jiggling. He volunteered to help sort donated supplies in the back room, a simple, practical task. As he organized boxes of hygiene kits and non-perishable snacks, he listened to the muted conversations from the common area. He heard fragments of stories, of loss, of chemical imbalances, of trauma, of the slow, hard work of managing the legions within. He saw the volunteers not as miracle workers, but as people offering a presence, a cup of coffee, a listening ear without judgment. They were not casting out demons with a word, but they were, in their own humble way, creating a space where chaos could be acknowledged and where perhaps a small measure of peace could be found. He thought of the Gerasene man sent back to his community to testify. His own small act of service felt like a part of that same ongoing mission. He wasn't healing anyone, but he was participating in a work of restoration, however small. He was bearing witness to the fact that brokenness was not a final state, that minds could be restored, that hope could flicker even in the darkest of tombs. The God who had commanded the legion was the same God who sustained the tired volunteer, who comforted the anxious visitor, who was present in the simple, unglamorous work of showing up and caring. As he left Haven Light that evening, the city lights blurring in the twilight, Eli felt a new layer of understanding settle upon him. The power to restore brokenness was not confined to the shores of Galilee. It was active here, now, in the quiet courage of those who fought their inner legions and in the compassionate hands of those who reached out to them. He had come to study a bizarre story of exorcism and had found instead a profound and moving testament to a love that seeks out the most lost, the most broken, and dares to call them back to themselves. Chapter 18. The Woman with the Issue of Blood. 12 years of bleeding was not just a medical condition. It was a slow, steady erosion of a life. It was a hemorrhage of hope, of community, of identity, leaving behind a hollowed-out woman defined by her uncleanness. Eli read the 5th chapter of Mark, and the story of the woman with the issue of blood unfolded with a quiet, desperate intensity that stood in stark contrast to the dramatic exorcism that preceded it. She moved through the crowd not as a person, but as a ghost, her touch a contamination, her presence a social sin. She had spent all she had on physicians, but instead of getting better, she had grown worse. Her poverty was not just financial. It was a poverty of spirit, a bankruptcy of options. Yet a stubborn, tenacious ember of faith still glowed in the ashes of her despair. It was not a faith of grand theological understanding, but a raw, visceral conviction, born of pure desperation. If I just touch his clothes, she thought, I will be healed. Eli pictured the scene with a painful clarity that squeezed his heart. The dusty road, packed with a jostling, noisy throng pressing in on Jesus, and there she was, on the fringes, her body weakened by years of loss, her face likely veiled in shame. She did not call out. She did not ask for an audience. She believed the power radiating from him was so tangible, so accessible, that it could be siphoned by the most furtive of touches. Eli saw her hand, thin and trembling, reaching through a forest of legs and robes, her fingers stretching, straining, until the very tips brushed against the coarse weave of his cloak. The effect was instantaneous. After 12 long years, the flow of blood dried up at its source. She felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. But in the same instant, Jesus stopped. He turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples were bewildered in such a crush. Everyone was touching him. But Jesus knew. He felt that power had gone out from him. It was not a theft, but a transaction of faith. The woman, realizing she could not remain hidden, came forward, trembling with fear. She fell at his feet and in front of everyone told him the whole truth. Eli felt her terror, the shame of her condition laid bare before the entire crowd, the dread that her healing might be revoked. But Jesus' response was not one of rebuke, but of affirmation. "Daughter," he said, a term of intimate belonging, "your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Her faith. Not the touch itself, but the desperate, audacious trust that propelled her to reach out. It was a faith that operated in the margins, that believed God's power could be accessed even when one felt unworthy to stand before Him. Her healing was as much about her restoration to community as it was about her physical cure. Jesus had not let her slip away anonymously. He had called her out, not to shame her, but to publicly restore her, to give her back her voice, her identity, her place as a daughter. This story of faith in the face of desperate, long-term suffering resonated with a deep and personal chord in Eli. He saw his own journey reflected in her 12-year struggle. His grief over his mother's death had been his own issue of blood, a persistent, draining wound that had left him feeling isolated and unclean in his own way, marked by a sadness that set him apart. He had tried everything to stanch the flow, intellectual pursuit, avoidance, anger, but nothing had worked. He had simply grown worse, more hollowed out. His own furtive reach for healing had been the small, stubborn decision to open his Bible, to journal his doubts, to step into a support group, to volunteer. They were not grand gestures, but like the woman's trembling touch, they were acts of a desperate faith, a reaching out for the hem of a grace he wasn't sure he deserved, and he had felt power go out. The peace in the chapel, the lifted burden of bitterness, the connection found in service, they were all moments of healing, small miracles of restoration that had begun to make him whole. Like the woman, he was being called out of anonymity. His faith was no longer a private, hidden thing. It was becoming a story he could tell. The following week, his turn came to share in his grief support group. When the facilitator nodded to him, he didn't just speak of his mother's death. He spoke of the long, bleeding wound it had left. He spoke of his flight from the pain, his own version of spending everything on physicians who could not help. And then, haltingly, he spoke of the stories that had been his touch on the cloak, the talking donkey that taught him to listen for God, in the humble, the floating axe head that showed him God cared about his small losses, the woman with the issue of blood who taught him that desperate faith was still faith. He shared his own story of hope, not as a finished product, but as a narrative in progress, a testament to a power that was still actively healing him. He did not present himself as a theologian with answers, but as a fellow traveler, a wounded healer reaching out from the crowd. As he spoke, he saw nods of understanding, looks of empathy. His story, woven with the ancient one, did not feel academic. It felt connective. After the meeting, a woman named Sarah approached him, her eyes glistening. "The part about the woman, that's me," she whispered. "I've felt unclean for so long, but hearing you say it, it makes me think maybe I can reach out too." In that moment, Eli understood the full circle of the story. He was not just the woman receiving healing, he was also now a part of the conduit. By sharing his own fragile hope, he was helping others find the courage to reach out their own trembling hands. He felt woven into a narrative far larger than his own grief, a tapestry of redemption that stretched from a dusty road in Galilee to a quiet room in a community center where broken people found the courage to touch the hem of grace and, in doing so, became threads of hope in the pattern of someone else's healing. Chapter 19, Lazarus raised. The scent of death was a fourth traveler on the road to Bethany, an invisible companion to the grief that walked beside Martha and Mary. Eli read the 11th chapter of John, and the story unfolded not with the immediacy of a miracle, but with the heavy, deliberate pace of divine timing stretched to its breaking point. Jesus, upon hearing of his friend's sickness, had chosen to wait. For 2 days he had remained where he was, while in Bethany a body cooled and a spirit fled, and the first faint stench of decay began to permeate the sealed tomb. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been in the grave 4 days, a fact Martha tearfully emphasized, the finality of it a stone sealing her hope as surely as the rock sealed her brother's cave. "Lord," she said, her voice thick with a faith that warred with despair, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Eli felt the weight of those 4 days, the agonizing stretch of time where every minute was a hammer blow to the sister's faith. He saw Jesus, not as a detached miracle worker, but as a man deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He wept. The shortest verse in Scripture carried a universe of empathy. The God who could command storms stood at a friend's grave and shed human tears. But the tears were not a surrender to death's dominion. They were a prelude to its overthrow. "Take away the stone," Jesus commanded. Martha's practical, horrified objection was pure humanity. "But, Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." The statement was a confession of the absolute physical finality of death. It was the last barrier of unbelief, and Jesus met it with a promise that was also a question, a challenge to the very nature of reality as she knew it. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Then came the prayer, not a plea, but a declaration of unity with the Father, spoken aloud for the sake of the mourning crowd. And then the voice. It was not a whisper or a chant, but a cry that tore through the silence of the grave, a command issued to a corpse. "Lazarus, come out!" Eli's breath caught. He imagined the scene inside the dark cave, the stillness, the shroud-wrapped form, the absolute void of life. And then movement, the rustle of linen, the shuffle of dead feet on cold stone, the gasps and cries of the crowd as a living man, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, his face wrapped with a cloth, emerged from the tomb into the blinding sunlight. The one who had been dead was now alive, standing before them, a walking, breathing contradiction to the kingdom of decay. The final command was one of practical compassion, of reintegration into the community of the living. "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Eli leaned back, the power of the resurrection story settling over him not as a theological abstraction, but as a seismic event that recalibrated the very meaning of life and death. This was not a healing, it was a resuscitation, a recall from the absolute finality of the grave. It was a preview, a down payment on a promise that death itself was a conquered enemy. Jesus had not just restored a man to his sisters, he had demonstrated his authority over the last and greatest human fear. The hope offered was not just for a prolonged life, but for a life that death could not ultimately hold. The themes of death and resurrection, so vividly enacted in Bethany, began to pulse within Eli's own spirit with a new and personal urgency. His mother's grave was not a sealed cave in a Judean hillside, but a neatly tended plot in the city cemetery, a place he had visited only once since the funeral, the pain too sharp, the finality too absolute. But the story of Lazarus, with its raw honesty about grief and its staggering declaration of hope, drew him there now. He drove through the iron gates in the soft, golden light of a late afternoon, the air cool and carrying the scent of cut grass and damp earth. He found her stone easily, a simple gray slab etched with her name and the dates that bookended her life. He stood before it, his hands in his pockets, the silence a different kind of companion now. He did not feel the same tearing grief he had felt months ago. Instead, he felt a profound, quiet peace. He thought of Martha's statement of faith, spoken even in her sorrow. I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. He realized that his own faith had journeyed to a similar place. He did not just believe in a historical resurrection of Lazarus or a future theological concept. He believed with a certainty that felt as solid as the ground beneath his feet in the eternal life of his mother. Her spirit was not gone. It was with the Lord. The body in the ground was a shell, a set of grave clothes waiting for its own come forth. Kneeling, he placed a hand on the cool, smooth stone. It was not a gesture of goodbye, but of acknowledgment. He acknowledged the pain of her absence, the reality of the separation, but he also acknowledged the greater reality proclaimed at the tomb of Lazarus, that for those in Christ, death is not a period, but a comma. It is a sleep from which the voice of the Son of God will one day awaken all who belong to him. The sorrow was real, but it was now enveloped in a hope that was more real still. The stone was rolled away from his own heart, and the stench of despair had been replaced by the fragrance of a promise. He rose to his feet, a renewed sense of eternal life burning within him, not as a distant doctrine, but as a present comfort. Lazarus had been raised as a sign, and standing at his mother's grave, Eli understood the sign's full meaning. Because he lives, she also lives. And that truth was a resurrection in itself. Chapter 20. The Transfiguration. The mountain air was thin and sharp, a blade of clarity that cut through the fog of ordinary perception. Eli read the 17th chapter of Matthew, and the story of the Transfiguration unfolded not as a mere miracle, but as a divine unveiling, a momentary parting of the curtain between the earthly and the eternal. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a high mountain, a place set apart from the clamor of the world below, a place where heaven could lean close to earth. There, before their astonished eyes, he was transfigured. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light, a brilliance not reflected, but emanating from his very being. This was not the Jesus of dusty roads and crowded villages. This was the Christ in his pre-existent glory, a glimpse of the divine radiance that he had willingly veiled in flesh. Eli's mind painted the scene with a sense of holy awe. The blinding, uncreated light, the sheer otherness of it would have been both terrifying and mesmerizing. Then, as if the veil were drawn back further, Moses and Elijah appeared, talking with Jesus. The law and the prophets, the twin pillars of Israel's history, stood in radiant conference with their fulfillment. The conversation was about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem, the exodus of all exoduses, the ultimate deliverance through the cross. Peter, overwhelmed and missing the point as usual, blurted out his desire to build 3 shelters to capture and institutionalize the moment. But while he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, the same voice that had spoken at the Jordan. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." The command was the culmination of the event. The glory was not for them to build booths around, but to listen to. The disciples fell face down to the ground, utterly terrified, the weight of the divine presence crushing their human frailty. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one but Jesus, only Jesus, the glory once again hidden within the familiar human frame. Eli closed the Bible, the afterimage of the transfigured Christ burning on the back of his eyelids. He saw it as the ultimate key to all the bizarre stories he had been studying. The talking donkey, the floating axe head, the stilled sun, the resurrection of Lazarus. They were all fleeting glimpses, refracted rays of the same divine power and glory that was fully, perfectly, and personally revealed in Jesus. The Transfiguration was the Rosetta Stone for understanding the strange and wonderful ways of God. It was a theophany that gave context to every other anomaly, a moment where the destination of all God's work was briefly, brilliantly illuminated. The purpose was not just to display power, but to reveal the person. All of history, all of the strange and bewildering narratives were pointing toward this moment on a mountain, and ultimately toward the hill of Calvary and the empty garden tomb. This dawning comprehension settled into a profound need for his own mountain, his own moment of clarity. The seminary was hosting a weekend retreat at a secluded camp in the rolling hills outside the city, and Eli signed up, driven by an instinct he could not name. The retreat center was simple, a cluster of cabins nestled among ancient pines, the air scented with pine resin and wood smoke. The schedule was loose, built around silence, prayer, and simple communal meals. On the second morning, Eli woke before dawn. He dressed quietly and slipped out of his cabin, following a narrow, winding path that led up a wooded ridge. The world was hushed, painted in shades of gray and indigo. The only sound, the crunch of his footsteps on the frost-rimed path and the distant call of an early bird. He reached the summit as the first sliver of sun breached the horizon, setting the eastern sky ablaze with streaks of orange and rose. Below him, the world lay sleeping in a blanket of mist, the distant city just a faint smudge on the edge of perception. He stood there on his own high mountain, the cold air stinging his lungs, and he let the silence wash over him. He did not try to pray. He did not try to think. He simply was. He stood and watched as the sun slowly burned away the mist, revealing the intricate tapestry of fields and forests below, each detail emerging with the growing light. And in that silent, sun-drenched moment, a clarity descended upon him that was as sharp and real as the mountain beneath his feet. It was not a voice from a cloud, but a settled, unshakable knowing that rose from the depths of his spirit. The long journey of doubt, the wrestling with grief, the slow, patient study of the bizarre and the beautiful, it had all been leading here. The stories were not just academic curiosities. They were a living, breathing testimony to a God who was intimately involved in his creation, a God whose glory could flash in a furnace, speak from a donkey, and shine from a man on a mountain. His faith was no longer a fragile construct to be defended, but a relationship to be lived. His purpose was no longer a vague notion, but a clear calling. He was to share these stories. He was to take the threads of the bizarre and the mundane, the ancient and the personal, and weave them together for others, to show them the pattern of divine purpose that ran through it all, pointing always to the transfigured Christ. The peace that filled him was more profound than any he had ever known. It was the peace of a puzzle finally solved, of a path finally clear. The sun, now fully above the horizon, warmed his face. He looked out at the unveiled world, and he saw it all as holy ground, charged with the grandeur of a God who transfigures not only his Son on a mountain, but broken hearts in library chairs and grieving souls on wooded ridges. He had come up the mountain with questions. He was going down with a calling. The thesis was no longer just an assignment. It was his first sermon. The stories were no longer just his study. They were his message. The clarity was absolute, and with it came a solidified faith and a purpose that felt as eternal as the light that had shone on the mountain.